Good morning, everyone. I know we have some people that are doing some last minute setting up. I just want to make sure that all of us in the room here, if you could put your microphone on mute. That way we can avoid the sound issues. So again, my name is Lisa Musalowitz. I'm staff legal counsel at the Department of Mental Health and Social Services. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not heeding my own voice, so advice, I'm sorry. Lisa Musalowitz again, I'm with staff counsel at the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. I want to thank you all for being here today. I know we have several more people that came into Columbus today, so thank you, and to all of those of you joining virtually, thank you as well. Just a few items before we get started. If you did order lunch here at the meeting and you haven't paid yet, you can do that at lunchtime. We'll have tables here where we collect that. If you are joining us in person here at the table, we do ask that you use the microphones to extend your hand.
Yours not on. I don't think. Yours is on.
Just to the bottom. And then say that you don't
Not
have
working
an
now.
account.
Okay. Now? Yeah. What's next?
That's good.
Okay, so they can hear me now. Okay, I will just try to speak up then, for the time being. So if we can, maybe we can contact Doris, I don't know. So in the meantime, if you can speak up, that would be great. I really appreciate it. For those of you who are attending virtually, just please make sure your audio is turned on and use your team mute and unmute for participation in the meeting when you want to speak. All Workgroup, please leave your team's video on as you feel comfortable. But we do ask that you leave it on when you're speaking. And when I acknowledge you to speak, I'm going to try to say your name. That helps us when we get the transcript to know who is speaking when. For members of the public and media, make sure your audio is turned on to hear the meeting. And if you have any difficulty joining virtually, you can always dial in by phone through the number 614-721-2972 and use the passcode 185312786#. If you are a member of the media, please put your name and organization in the chat box. Thank you. So for those attending in person, we have provided a paper agenda, and this is also the agenda that was sent to you last week. It's our revised agenda. We have allocated certain blocks of time to each of the roundtable discussions today. And so if we are getting close to the end of one of those time blocks, I'm going to let you all know, that we'll take one or two comments so that we can move on to the next discussion. I also don't anticipate that we will get through all of the last roundtable discussion items. So we do plan on continuing that at our next meeting in June. All right. So the next slide, then. I'm sorry. Is that the next one after that? Oh, you can go to the next one. And then, so our first topic on the agenda is recovery housing. This is a continuation of a discussion that we had at our last meeting. The governing statute is 340.034. Next slide. As a refresher for all of us, this slide shows the comments that work group members made on the topic of recovery housing, both through the survey and at our last meeting. As both columns indicate, several members commented that mandatory certification for recovery homes should be seriously considered. Although one member was concerned about the loss of Fair Housing Act protections if that was done. Some members also asked whether the general prohibition on board ownership and operation of recovery housing in Division C of 340.034 should be eliminated, with one member commenting that recovery housing that has a connection to an add-on board is generally higher quality. Others mentioned utilization of medication-assisted treatment, and you'll note that current Division G specifies that recovering housing may permit its residents to receive that. Some members pointed out that community stigma toward recovery housing is an issue. And then another member suggested that there would be a registry or other central location where individuals could research a home's quality, similar to what we have for nursing homes. Since several of you expressed concern regarding oversight of recovery housing here in Ohio, I thought I'd start off by asking, should recovery housing in Ohio have some form of oversight through Ohio MOS? So if we could start the discussion there, and then we also have some other questions, but we'll begin with that. I see Sherry has raised her hand.
Unfortunately, I have a question.
Oh, a question, okay.
Would it be possible to talk about the latest letter that went out about recovery housing, the certification, and the funding? Because I think that will impact this overall discussion, if you could, because I think that's helpful.
Sure. I probably don't need a microphone, but I'm
For our friends online.
okay. So as part of our taking a look at recovery housing and looking at some of the suggestions that were made from the field, one suggestion that was made brought back to the office was to make sure that our funding is tied to certified recovery houses through ORH. And so we have been, kind of slow walking that process for some time. And this is the time that, as of July 1st, if you are going to fund recovery houses with public dollars from the department, those recovery houses must be ORH certified. And so I think we've given the field some time to acclimate to that rule. We had a bifurcated approach in the last couple of years where certain funding was requiring ORH certified recovery housing and other funding streams were not. Now we're unifying that and bringing it all together. And so any funds that are used from the department to support recovery houses must support recovery houses that are Ohio Recovery Housing certified. Do you have any questions? I see a frown, Sherry.
You saw that through this mask. It was isn't it any funds from a local board and not just state funds? Or did I miss that?
Ours is from state dollars.
State, okay.
More pass-through from federal dollars to our department. I think the other thing I'd add is that it's national accreditation. And so our department has a relationship with Ohio Recovery Housing, and they are certifying according to the NAR standards, the National Alliance for Recovery Residences. We know that Oxford House is another model that is existing in Ohio, and that CARF also has a national accreditation for supportive housing that does take a recovery residence philosophy to it. So those are the three that we talk about as being recognized, and more generically nationally recognized quality recovery housing standards specifically. The other thing I wanted to just acknowledge for the room is that there has been a piece of legislation introduced that speaks to the national model legislation for recovery residences. And that was introduced within the past month. And it has several elements to it that are either already in code for other states or are being pursued by other states. And there was a national forum that came together under the previous federal administration that made these, I guess, recommendations for this model legislation for states to look at. And so that was used in the drafting of the bill that was introduced within the past month.
You know, I just want to say, a year ago, we required all of our recovery houses to be certified. I just think it has a standard for the people living there. And it goes well, but we sort of took an extra step. If they weren't, we were willing to work with them. And that's why I got a little nervous when we talked about just board money, money for the department, because we'll use our local levy money to help them get certified. So if certification is cumbersome or some of the regulations, but we just think of the quality of care, that should be the standard. And if someone doesn't want to meet those standards, then that's a red flag, we think, because they're not that overwhelming.
Pressure?
I'm supposed to take my camera off. I can't feel all this at once. I don't see a red button, come on. There we go.
I just wanted to know, like, what would be the rationale to not have certification?
So I would pose that question to your peers on the committee and not to the department staff, because we're really looking for a discussion among, stakeholders from across the state to help inform that, the discussion.
And pressure, do you mean state certification through the department?
Or certification through what we already have with ORH. You know, is it that we think what's available through ORH is enough? And that's why we wouldn't want state certification? Because I'm a little confused. Why would we make a big difference between anybody that we house that struggles with mental illness versus addiction in terms of trying to get the highest quality that we can?
Sure. Looks like Danielle would like to respond. Thank you.
Yes, so for us, recovery housing is housing, and I think that Ohio has taken great steps to treat recovery housing as housing, not as a care facility, not as a treatment center. It's a housing environment. And if we were to transition it more to state licensure, that transitions that housing, the work to have it be considered housing to be considered as a facility, as a licensed facility. And what I know we see is many NIMBY issues in our communities. We want our recovery homes located in areas of opportunity. We want residents to be fully integrated into their communities. And therefore, we need to keep recovery housing so we can protect those fair housing rights of people with substance use disorders within our communities. And it's very easy for communities it's easier for communities to discriminate when it's a facility, when it's a care facility. And so that's one reason why we want to try to keep recovery housing. And then when it comes to regulating recovery homes, I mean, these are people with disabilities living together by manner of association. And there's an entire Department of Justice and HUD letter that describes that we cannot require those homes of people with disabilities choosing to live together by manner of association in any way that we wouldn't regulate, a normal family living together, because they are a protected class. And so what we can do is have a voluntary certification and then require that voluntary certification for things like funding or referrals. And that's what a lot of other states have done. And that legislation, House Bill 632, that's the direction that it takes that in. So we can keep recovery housing as housing, keep it regulated as housing, keep the housing integrated in our communities where people have, access to areas of opportunity, but then also, just control where the dollars go and where resources go. And we know that for many of these places, if they're not able to get funding, if they're not able to get referrals, I mean, that essentially is a mandatory requirement for certification and for quality. So hopefully that answers, some of the question, at least from my perspective at ORH.
Thank you, Daniel. Jeff O'Neill?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. You have your hand raised. Did you want to?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, sorry.
Oh, no, okay. No worries. Did anyone else have their, Jamal, did you have your hand raised?
I did, but the question I had was answered, but I would share just from a comment perspective. I'm curious as to just the inclusion of the business aspect of that in terms of being certified. Does the certification allow us to, one, be able to, or the change rather, excuse me, give us access to more accountability at the state level, meaning more resources being needed to manage and oversee this process that's currently not in place? And what are we looking at it in that, excuse me, I'm sorry, the ambulance is going by. Somebody's getting helped. I wanted to just, I guess have a discussion or get some insight on the business side of that. Because if it's not currently regulated, then that would mean someone has to regulate it. And in that regulation, what resources would be needed to do that so that the certification process is managed and reported on as it would be defined in the code.
Does anyone have any comments on that?
I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, and I can only speak to ORH certification. I can't speak to, CAR for Oxford House, but if we offer the certification and we have standards of quality and we provide, a certificate and we charge fees for that, and we have, our partnership with the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services and work with them, to adjust that process for what the needs of Ohio are. But it's, in my mind, it's very similar to CARP accreditation, where, you go, you get your CARP accreditation, and then the state accepts that as your certification. So I'm not sure what you mean by impacting the business side, or if you're asking a question about like what's the oversight for ORH as we implement the standards. We're also part of NAR, and so we don't do our jobs well, we can lose our affiliation with NAR. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if I'm misunderstanding.
It does.
If you want to know.
No, thank you. It does. It was the latter of what you mentioned in terms of really who's managing, where the staffing and the hours and the process being housed. And if the state were to take that process over, what does that look like from an already drained resource perspective, or as a new division being created? Where would it be housed and how would that process work? That's what I was trying to get at, because again, if we're revising the code or changing the process, I think all of what we may do may have some type of financial implication or workforce implication. And that needs to be considered as we're thinking through this.
So I'm gonna ask a clarifying question for the group. In thinking about accreditation for recovery residences, Jamal, you mentioned the state taking that over. So the model legislation has two options: the state taking it over, or the state accepting accreditation from nationally recognized bodies. So can you guys discuss that a little bit in terms of which you think makes sense for Ohio? And the constituents that you're representing with your voices here today.
Teresa?
So I think in Ohio, we have a long history of accepting and recognizing national accreditation. And I think that has been proven to demonstrate there is a quality standard of that type of practice. And that's the model we've been working under as we built recovery housing in Ohio. And again, we're talking about this as housing. So we don't regulate through your department other types of housing. We regulate licensed residential programs, and this isn't a residential program. It's housing with a housing kind of first component, a social model of recovery, so that you're supporting people in their recovery. So I think, given where we are, and this is we've talked about for a while, movement towards requiring qualities, an expectation of quality, which is in the current revised code, that recovery houses shall have quality protocols. So now we're putting that in place to say, if you want to receive funding, that this is the expectation. So I think that's a really important step. And then in the draft legislation, there's also a requirement around registries. And I think registries are another piece so that, from a consumer standpoint, there's transparency around if you're operating recovery housing, that the consumer knows, is this place, does it have certification? Does it have this national accreditation or not? And so that the people using the homes have that informed information. I think those are two important pieces from a person-centered care or person-centered service design that we really, is why I think that, following through with national accreditation is where we should really focus.
Molly?
So thank you, Teresa. The only thing I would add to that is that what I think needs to be added is additional funding. If we are requiring higher quality, which we must, then we need to provide the resources that are needed to achieve that. And that is what the people that we serve deserve.
Marsha?
What would be the implications if we went with national accreditation of what we already have in place with our recovery housing? So would that be eliminated, or would it be that we would just expect that those would be the standards that they would follow?
So, I don't think that what we do through RH would be eliminated, because we're the ones who implement the one set of those national standards. So, if you try to call NAR, like the national office, and say, hey, I want to get certified by NAR, and you're in Ohio, what they will tell you is you need to contact Ohio Recovery Housing, because they delegate that activity to their state affiliates. And so if you want to get certified by NAR and you're in the state of Ohio, you have to go to ORH. And so that part wouldn't change at all. So we would still do our process of, certifying homes. And then as well, people would also have the choice to get, the CARF accreditation, that other national accreditation, as well as Oxford houses would also be able to receive referrals. And a big part of this discussion too, piggybacking off what Teresa was saying about a registry, we also need language, and I can't stress the fair housing issues enough. And just in the past month, we've seen a lot of issues in our state. In the city of Ironton, they recently passed an ordinance, and at first it was like, hey, we just want all of our recovery homes to register. And so they sent a letter to all the recovery homes and said, we just want you to register. We just want you to know where you are. And if you're certified, provide that consumer protection information. People fill out forms, they register, and as you can all imagine, all of our good law-abiding people were like, you know what, do what the city says, I'm gonna register. And then they filled out the forms, how many people they're serving. Then they passed an ordinance that says you can only have 3 or fewer unrelated adults And they went to that registry and they sent letters to every single home that had more than 3 unrelated adults and said, you must reduce your population within your home or we're gonna start fining you. Now, yes, it's probably illegal. I'm not a lawyer, I can't make that claim, but it sounds to me like it's illegal and there's going to be lawsuits about that. But that really disrupts, the system within that community and access within that community. And witnessing that happen in Ironton, I'm really afraid of what we're gonna do if we have a registry at the state level. And it's only tied to funding that comes from the department, because we know that a lot of recovery homes out there that make us raise our eyebrows, that are resisting certification, that are resisting quality standards, they're not getting any funding from the department. They're funding their models in different ways. And those are the folks that, cause us a little heartburn and cause us a little concern, but they're not going to be impacted by that. And instead, you're going to create this whole registry of recovery homes, and there's stigma against recovery housing in our communities. And I'm really worried that we're going to see what played out in Ironton, play out on a statewide level, where communities are just going to pass restrictive ordinances, start sending letters. And a lot of our folks are small nonprofit organizations, or they're extremely small mom and pop businesses. They don't have the resources, and the wherewithal, and quite frankly, the energy after living through what they've lived through for the past 2 years to fight these fights. And they just simply don't have the resources to do it. So we need really strong language that comes with a referral requirement, because that's what's gonna work. That covers everybody. And that's what other states have done. And so we need that. And we also need language that clarifies for our local governments how they can treat recovery homes, that empowers them with the tools that they need to help enforce their own building codes, their own zoning codes. People have to follow those, but clarifies that people living in recovery as a matter of association, living together as a family, should be treated like any other family. And that communities can't just kick them out because they don't want, that kind of person in their community. Because that's what we hear over and over again. And just between the last meeting that we had and this one, all of this played out. There's some other nutty stuff happening in Portsmouth, Ohio as well, around recovery housing, them trying to create a registry where it's gonna cost 10 grand plus $250 per bed to be on this registry. I mean, this is what we're seeing play out in our communities, and I just don't want to see it happen on a statewide level.
Dwayne?
Yeah, I just have a question. I wonder your thoughts on this, because I'm not sure about trademarking the name Recovery House, because the problem that I have is that most of them are really good people, but there's some people that aren't good that take advantage, and they'll just call it a recovery house. So I just wonder what your thoughts on that are.
I'm not a patent attorney, so I don't know what all goes into trademarking, but I do know we have a very solid definition of what recovery housing is within, chapter 340 right here. And that's a great definition of recovery housing. And if we see someone who says hey, I'm running a recovery home and they don't meet that definition, I don't know what you are, but that's not a recovery home and they shouldn't be calling it that. But unfortunately, right now, there's, we still provide funding to those places. We still allow them to do that. And there's really, I hear about it all the time, but there's nothing I can do about it. Unless they want to come to me and get a certification as a recovery home, then I can say, okay, here's what you need to do to be an actual recovery home. And like Molly said, we need those resources because there are a lot of people who are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to do the work. And this goes back to the governor's comments about how the system's not broken, it's just never fully built. Well, we need to build this part of the system. We need to invest the resources to help people fully build out these programs and services so that way they can be recovery homes and not just be a boarding house for people with substance use disorders, not just be a group living environment for people with substance use disorders, but meet that definition in the revised code, meet all the quality standards, and provide all those high quality services. So that needs to come with all of this effort to build out this entire system. This is a part of the system.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, Sharon.
You brought up Portsmouth, and I agree with 90% of what you said there. But the one thing, I mean, we need some way when there is a home that is kind of out of pocket to figure out how we can handle it. For example, in Portsmouth, there's a home, I don't know who it is, I'm not gonna get that, that has 3 bedrooms and 16 people in it. That's not acceptable recovery housing. But yet they sell themselves to the community as we're recovery housing and we're working with all these people. I mean, so while absolutely we don't want to over control and we want housing to be housing, we have to have some way that we can address issues that are clearly not acceptable. And so I don't know what the fine line between that is, but I do think that that's where people get very frustrated because it's this big either or, and somehow we got to find somewhat of a middle ground. So I would just add that.
Tracy?
This is fun, okay. I just wanted to comment, my career started in the 90s, and I remember when we first had peer-run organizations certified, and many of these same discussions occurred and the challenges that the peer-run organizations may face. But we collaborated with those organizations and helped them achieve certification. I personally wrote policies for a couple of them. And with the idea being that, we're adding the quality and accountability, which any entity that receives any state or federal dollars needs to be accountable for those dollars. And the only way to achieve that is through some form of regulation. And it makes perfect sense to defer to national accreditation rather than the state organizing this so that they do retain their fair housing rights. And I'd love to hear that the board would help them, cover the cost of accreditation. I know CARP well, and it's a very provider-friendly model. And I also think that, if Firelands wanted to continue collaboration with a recovery housing and watch them grow and develop, we would certainly partner with our local provider to help them achieve accreditation if that's what they needed. And I think many others would as well.
Michael?
Yeah, I would echo everything that everyone said about the national standards. I don't see any advantage of deferring that to the discretion of the state, particularly from a fair housing perspective. But I do want to talk about the registry for a moment, because I just think in its practical application, the likely person who ends up in a recovery housing may very well be referred there from a treatment center or facility. And oftentimes that individual may not be searching ORH or the state and finding registries. They're taking the advice of those people who are providing and administering them treatment. And I think if that treatment provider were to be able to access a list of those recovery housing options that are certified, that would support the integrity of that process. Many times those referrals aren't made where the treatment center is. It might be 2 hours away, more proximate to that individual's home. So that person is really relying on information that may or may not, put them in a quality setting. So, thank you.
Terry?
I have a big concern that through all this discussion, and appreciate everybody, that we're not talking about the client, the person needing the care. And at our last meeting, I got challenged because I said it's bad homes better than under the bridge. And I'm sorry if nobody's been under the bridge and said that. I've been there. I've been to the homeless shelters. I've been to prisons and jails where people languish. So it's our response. We're the ones who have failed, not the clients who need this care, in not providing the resources needed, the qualities needed. But just to say, well, let's go and make houses better. And for those that aren't, what happens to the people in those homes? I am watching people being released from state hospitals and mostly from the private hospitals to the shelters. How can we accept that? So today, what we're talking about, bad homes, recovery homes, adult care facilities, whatever. We have to start with the client. Where are they going to go if we do all these regulations and certifications? Where are they going to go? You can say, oh, we'll just regulate them, and if they're not regulated, we'll just let them go. I had a person at our conference this week, a sister, talking about Lawrence County, a home closed, nobody knew about it. And her brother ended up in a homeless shelter after 20 years in this facility. And then it ended up in some worse situations. We had to go, what do we do with those people? When I started with the adult care facilities 20 years ago, I went down to Steubenville, Ohio, where there were 6 terrible rates going on in the homes. And my job at NAMI is I went to Jefferson County Board called and said, nobody will help. So I went down and it was awful. I cried when I left the place. Never seen anything like it. And we closed them. And Mike Hogan gave us $700-some thousand to buy the 6 homes so providers could run them. But a year later, I found one of the guys was found in a warehouse, hadn't taken a bath in the year, and he was eating out of trash cans. So maybe I didn't do a good job. Somebody's life was affected by this. We want the best we can have for these clients, and all of us did. But remember, we stood sharp with the clients and what do they need, how much do they need, and find the resources to provide what they need. But we get into these conversations about certification, licensure. People, let's not us be stigmatized. People living in some of the best homes I know are on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. Lovely people in a terrible housing situation, but they provide loving care. So let's keep the client up there at the top. That's not too parallel. That was being too emotional. I'm not.
So let me, thank you. It's always good to recenter on the people who are receiving the services, so thank you for that. So taking that and trying to have a both and situation, not an either or situation. Adding accountability and quality to housing is something that I've heard the group say is a priority. How do we do that and make sure that people don't get displaced and put into more dangerous situations? There's something in code that we need to do. So I think there's probably some programmatic things or some investments that we need to think about. But in terms of 340, is there something in code that we need to do to help ensure that practice?
And so again, thank you for, having that focus on the individual and you're right, I don't think that it has to be like, I think there's this perception that like, oh, if we increase regulation or if we look at certification, things we can do in code, that means that there's going to be this decrease in access. And I don't think that has to be the case. I mean, I've seen, just recently, if you've read papers over this weekend, there was several years ago, there was a recovery housing operator here in Central Ohio that got shut down. And there were hundreds of people living in those houses. And that organization has since been taken over. We've worked with them to help them develop new policies, new procedures, make sure people living in the homes had access to peer support, make sure they had access to resources. And, they're now certified by our organization and they maintain that capacity in housing. Now, some of the houses they had were not good, so they had to get rid of those houses and get different houses. But it wasn't this situation where the houses were shut down and now people had no place to go because it was done in a planful manner. But that organization chose to become certified and is now voluntarily certified. There's no one requiring it. There's no one saying that they have to do it. And I just feel like if there was more of an incentive saying like, hey, you have to do this. This is the way you have to do this. So if an organization does have low quality, they have to do something in order to make it better. So that way it's not a choice between, shutting this place down and having people be homeless, but there's resources and support and help available for them to come up to quality, or there'll be another organization that can come in and, provide quality housing if that organization, is unable to do that. So I just want to push back on this notion that like, oh, having quality standards or having certification means that we're going to lose capacity. Because I don't think that's the case. And I've also seen many people achieve certification and their organizations grow. Because when you run a quality home and when you're doing things really well, you attract, good business, you attract, a positive relationship in your community. And they've been able to grow and expand and even grow in capacity. So I feel like us doing more in the code to encourage that, we may not achieve those spheres of just having places shut down, but we do need to do it in the right way. And like you said, programmatically as well, outside of stuff that's in the revised code.
Yeah, Tom?
I agree. I mean, having standards are essential and they are customer focused. To not have standards means that the individual can experience something that they certainly don't deserve. We had a family in Lorraine. I was contacted after the fact that they went to what they thought was recovery housing. They made a payment to the recovery housing. Their loved one went in and they didn't hear anything for a week. Well, when it was discovered that he had overdosed 3 days before and nobody found him, that was a problem. I think that there needs to be, and all standards set are minimum standards, minimal acceptable standards. I don't think that is too much of a burden to make sure that we have established what are those acceptable living standards that people need to experience. So I vote on the side of having some quality standards, which can only be done through some level of certification.
Teresa? Yeah, I agree with that, and I think, the other point, and Terry, this is the other piece, we don't have enough housing. We don't, period. Affordable housing for anyone is a challenge, and then if you add disability, you add mental health condition, you add substance use disorder, you add criminal charges, then we run into this broader issue, from a public policy perspective of how do we just have access to, quality, affordable housing? Because that's part of the other challenge that really, I think, underpins where we run into these challenges. We need to do the quality piece from a standard of care, making sure people have, a place to live that's going to support their recovery, whether it's from a mental illness, whether it's from a substance use disorder. And so part of, I think, our charge as systems is how do we start to impact that from a funding perspective, from a access perspective. But then when we look at what we can kind of build or, move, where we have some ability to move the ball forward is by following national accreditation, by saying, if we're going to use resources to support people, we want to make sure it's going to places that give them a better likelihood. It doesn't solve the broader issue. And certainly with, where we are in the current economy, finding affordable housing is becoming much, much harder. And so that's the other issue from a financing perspective, from a public policy. I don't think that it changes the code in 340, but that's the underlying issue we haven't collectively solved that we really need to be focused on as well.
Totally agree with that, and have to say that all of us agree with certificate, the quality. We want the best quality we can have. But if we don't solve the problem of the lack of opportunity, housing opportunities, look at the people going to jail and prisons and under the bridges and today because we don't have the opportunities. That's where we have to start and then talk about wherever we put them, having the quality standards that you need.
Fresh and then we're gonna move on to a different question, but sure, go ahead.
So I wanted to respond to Terry's hand question, and I think there is a distinction between affordable housing and supervised housing. And I think this gets back to the point of the need for our systems to have different levels of care. I don't mean that by a clinical word or something like that, but the affordable housing is a challenge, going to be a challenge, continues to be a challenge, and we can all be a voice in that.
But I think we have an obligation to figure out how to right-size the capacity that's needed for supervised housing. And that supervised housing includes recovery housing, but it also includes individuals that struggle with mental illness that need that. And that's not general affordable housing. That's a different level of our system that we need. And I don't know, when I think about the statute in relationship to that is, where does that responsibility lie? To look at your community, to know how much of that you need, to figure out how do we get that built? What is the responsibility of the state to say that we need more than outpatient and inpatient? We have to build different levels and have a way of envisioning like when the governor talks about it hasn't all been built yet, how do we envision how much we need and getting that in place? And that, some part of that in terms of the level of assessment, the level of that kind of thing, I think I don't know a good way to say it, but I think that is building those different levels is a statutory responsibility that needs to get into the. I think it's cool.
In terms of the code specifically, if we agree that there should be, some form of national accreditation, and we know that the state or federal funding cannot be used for housing unless it's accredited, then wouldn't the code need revised to reflect that expectation more clearly? Because all it references is the board can use levy funds, but it doesn't say the board cannot use state dollars or federal dollars passed through the state.
Sure, yeah, that kind of leads into the next question of, should Ohio must licensed providers be absolutely required to refer only to recovery housing that meets the national standards? What do you all think about?
I'm Bobby Douglas. I'm from 180 in Worcester, and we operate 10 recovery houses and are just opening 24, what used to be called level 3, but transitional housing beds. And I think that that's been a huge issue in different communities. We've been blessed, not as much in ours, but that just anybody can put up a shop and don't have to meet any standards. A lot of times it's more attractive to people with active addiction because there may be less rules or I have not seen it be a good situation. And maybe I'm wrong with this. Maybe I'm too used to dealing with standards. I don't see the standards as being prohibitive, like that they're really difficult to meet.
Danielle?
And I would say that the requirement is really important, because we know that a lot of the recovery housing that is, coming into communities, how those organizations get their businesses through those referrals. And I think a lot of individuals, and like, what Michael said, a lot of families, a lot of people, they think if they get a referral from a licensed treatment provider, that's who they're trusting. They're trusting that licensed treatment provider to give them a referral to a quality place. People aren't gonna think to check, like, well, let me go check the registry to see if this place that my trusted treatment provider gave me. They just assume that the treatment provider is giving them information about a quality place. And when people call me with concerns, they're shocked to find out that no, like for a lot of places I hear about, we can't do anything about places that aren't certified by us. And they're shocked when they find out, well, no one has looked at them. And if they don't have a funding relationship with their county board, there's nothing the county board can do either. And so that referral requirement really is important, because that, again, a lot of recovery homes or places that are calling themselves recovery homes, they don't get the funding through their board. And so it'll be status quo unless we can change that.
Michael?
Yeah, You know, I agree, yes, we should require that. I think that, again, to add to what Danielle just said, if we're going to make quality of such high importance, then we should mandate it upon referral so that we're creating that expectation for the end user. You know, there's been some conversation recently about putting the client first. Well, that's exactly what this does. Putting the client's needs, putting that client in the best position to be successful in the recovery journey by guaranteeing some minimum quality standards that are met through that referral. So I think it is very important.
Molly?
Well, I don't want to be too redundant, but I do want to speak up on behalf of the people that we serve and say that it is critically important that those trusted relationships that vulnerable people have developed with potential referral sources needs to be protected. And one way of doing that is requiring the enforcement of the law with the referral process. I also just want to remind all of us that we're really not talking about consumers or clients or patients or any other thing but people. So it's really helpful to me, I'll just say that, if we all recenter ourselves again in terms of our language and talk about the people.
Samantha, did you have a comment?
And I agree with everything that's being said. I represent a behavioral health organization in Southeastern Ohio. So just some things that have come to mind is, so a similar process we're in with the state where, all youth residentials were required to move towards QRTP standards. So, which required CARF accreditation or CO or something like that. So I think to Terry's point, I'd like to hear from that process. Did we lose providers? Did we lose access through that process? Or was there solutions along the way, to Danielle, what you said, that allow existing housing to remain existing housing, through the support that we gave through the process? So, I'd be interested to hear how that process went. A couple concerns I have around the registry is, so we also do housing development as an organization. And as much as I want, so registry, I think at some point with limited access feels okay to me. But as we try to build housing in communities, we're not there yet. And I think the registry will limit those of us who are part of housing development at this time. I just don't think we're past the stigma enough for it not to become a barrier yet. And the other thing I'd say is requiring us to only refer to certified housing. Again, agree with it. Also, I serve a region that has very little housing, and it is very difficult to get people who are doing housing, recovery housing included, to come to the region, right? Because our populations are less. It's not a good business model. So I just wanted us to make sure that as we think about this, it will impact, we may have, some communities may have lots of housing and recovery housing to serve people. We have counties with no shelters. So Terry mentioned sometimes worst case scenario is we're sending people from treatment to a shelter. We have counties that don't have a shelter. So we just, this can't be applied in a time frame the same across the state either. So I just wanted to make those points.
I have a question, and this is partly me being relatively newer in Ohio. Where I hail from, there was a very a significant connection between the housing community and the behavioral health community. And I haven't experienced that so much here. So I'm wondering if there's some process that we can implement that would be more collaborative with our homelessness coalitions. I worked a little bit with the the rural homelessness folks, and learned through that process that there's really not a lot of homeless housing even in the rural areas, let alone recovery housing, but nobody knows who each other is either. So it's like, I ask them if there's recovery housing in their area and they don't know. So that's a question, actually. Is there a way that we can work with this to be more collaborative and partner with our housing, our homelessness, profile?
I do have one other question too. I was going to present to the group before we wrap up this session. So I wanted to get to that, but do you have something quickly, Samantha?
I was just gonna comment on that. So ISBH is actually also the lead for the homelessness. So we are the lead for Region 17. So, I mean, I think that there is a lot of that happening. I think it goes back to some of the larger questions around just how housing is not available. And we really, so there's a lot of collaboration, at least in the 7 counties that we're supporting. It's just really a lack of resources and getting things to the region.
Thank you. So I also wanted to ask about, because another comment that came up was about board ownership of recovery housing, board ownership and operation of recovery housing. Wanted to get your thoughts on whether the current restrictions on that are in the code should be revised. Prussia.
So you all need to know that that language came right out of Hancock County. It did. And it came out of the discrimination in our community about trying to get recovery housing in place. And the rationale for putting that in there is because we don't have a nonprofit housing developer. So the board owns all of the housing that we have. And so they wanted to put language in there so we couldn't get any more housing for this population. And so I guess from my perspective, I don't know why we would prohibit a board from owning this kind of housing when we don't prohibit them from owning any other kind of housing. And I know it was put in there to try to further restrict the development of resources across the state for people that struggle with addiction and need recovery housing.
Yeah. Dwayne?
I'm confused.
Dwayne, could you use the microphone? I'm sorry.
First, I'm confused. Say that again. In your county, other people wanted the board to operate, or you wanted to operate?
In our community, we don't have a nonprofit housing development corporation. We tried for 3 years to get one. So all of the housing that we own, we have 11 properties where we try and provide all different kinds of housing. When we tried to put recovery housing in place, there was a huge uproar in our community to the point that an LLC was actually established to oppose us. And that LLC was very strong advocates with our representative at the time and proposed getting this language into the statute as a way of saying the board can't own recovery housing, so she's not gonna ever open another one. Like she got a visa, she's never gonna open another one, and we're gonna make sure other boards in the state can't open up recovery housing. And so luckily, some of these caveats, as 1, 2, 3 are underneath there, that, kind of still allow for boards to do it in circumstances. But my point is, a board can own any other kind of property. So why would we you know, have a restriction on this kind. And because I know it came from the perspective of, that's exactly where it came from.
I guess my confusion was own and operate, so
No,
you
we
can own it, but you also say an operator.
Oh, no, we don't operate, we don't
Right,
operate,
we
we don't operate. our own.
I
We
understand
own
that.
properties and then,
Right,
you know, our
That provides
agencies manage them.
Right.
This is about ownership.
okay.
I'd also like to check in with any of our virtual participants. Do you have any thoughts on this topic? Want to chime in? Not see anyone yet, so.
And I'll throw that out to the group. Is there, are we splitting hairs between own and operate as you look at the statute?
So that's actually what I just did, was look at what does the language say? Because, you know, little words like and mean a lot. So it says that recovery housing shall not be owned and operated. So it's owned and operated. So I would read that in a literal way to say, if you own it, but don't operate it, you're not in violation of the statute. I'm not a lawyer.
No, you're right. I'm just saying,
Not a
I
lawyer,
get it. That's why,
I play this on TV some days.
that's why, you know, that's why early on, when we tried to push to get it out right away, you know, it was like, well, there's a hole here, there's a hole there, and so on and so forth. I'm just saying, why have it in there at all? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Why have it in there at all?
No, I hear your statement.
I think
And I
we were
appreciate
at
that
recovery
this is-
housing at the time.
Yeah, I appreciate the historical reminder of why this was in there as well. But it doesn't sound like I'll just ask the question more clearly. Is there a concern with boards operating recovery housing?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I don't think boards
Right.
don't deliver services and shouldn't deliver services.
Okay, so owning the property and managing the property is different than operating.
I would totally, yes, yes.
May I ask a question? Wouldn't that create a conflict of interest if you were the landlord?
Well, I will tell you, and this might be very different in a larger area. But, and Terry was around, long time ago. In our community, we're really small and we only have one very large provider. And it was really at their request that the board be the landlord, because they didn't want to, as the treatment agency, to feel like they could hang that over somebody's head as part of their treatment. So we could separate their housing from, you know, what their treatment needs were and that kind of thing. So, you know, ideally what we'd love to have a nonprofit housing corporation where we would put it all over there. We just don't have, and we're trying to create that assured clear distance. So somebody's housing is theirs and a treatment provider does not have to, in their discussions with them, talk about collecting their rent or doing anything like that.
Thank you.
There was a chat from Jamal. Did you want to add anything?
I'm still a little confused.
Molly?
Not surprisingly. So if you're operating it, then
We're not.
but you're not.
No.
And so how does that actually provide the separation? If the treatment provider who is leasing the property from you is also operating the recovery home, how does the fact that you own the land provide separation?
Like with our recovery housing, our recovery organization manages the home. They hire who is, you know, overseeing the home. They do everything that they do. We have a property manager that takes care of the house, you know, like the furnace is broken, that's broken, so on and so forth, and collects any program fees. that are associated with that.
Okay,
So,
that's helpful. Thank you.
but, yeah.
We have a hand raised from Mike Matoni. Mike, are you, you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. I put this in the chat, but this is a very great discussion. I just want to point out that please be inclusive of adolescents in the discussion for recovery housing in Ohio, because New Directions in the east side of Cleveland does have a recovery housing program for adolescents.
Mike, is there anything that you'd add to the discussion that you've heard today that's specific to adolescents? Maybe that's a different consideration from what we've talked about. So for me personally, I typically have adults in mind when I talk about recovery housing. So I've been listening to this with the lens of people over the age of 18. And I honestly, maybe not even families, as I've been processing the information. So if there's any comments specific to adolescents or families, that would be really helpful too.
Yeah, I don't have any at this time other than, there's just different, perhaps legal and legal requirements for, parental or guardian, agreement, to enter a recovery housing program that probably doesn't exist in the adult world. That probably is one of the main differences.
Thank you.
So I think we are sounding like we may be ready to move on to our next topic. I know we are at that time period, so we will go ahead and do that. So moving on, the next discussion segment is on Adam Board's powers and duties. And first, we're going to be looking at 340.03 and 340.08, which specify the duties of the boards. And then we will look at 340.037, which pertains to board operation of a residential facility, and 340.05, which pertains to complaints of abuse and neglect in the residential facility. We will then take our lunch break at around 11:45, and so we'll continue this discussion after the lunch break. So next slide. So 340.03 is a list of 14 Adam Board powers and duties. And I know it's hard to read it on the slide, so I provided each of you here in the room a paper copy, and then I also emailed this out last night. I wanted to get everything onto one piece of paper just because I felt like it was easier to refer to it that way. So looking at all of, I'm not going to read through this entire list, but rather I just want to put it out to you. What should the essential functions of a board be? Is starting with planning? Can you speak to that? Molly?
Well, one of the things that I know is, or I believe to be the sort of the mission of the boards is to be filling gaps in services in their communities. And in that planning process, focusing on a recovery-oriented system of care. And if I'm not right about that, I'm happy to be corrected. The challenge I see is certainly that we find a lot of gaps still in services. And so I don't know. I mean, I think the plan, I don't have a problem with the board having that as their purview by any means, as long as there's plenty of community input. And I think that might be part of the challenge along the way, is making sure there's lots of community input in that process. But as we've talked about before, sometimes it's hard to get community input. However, I don't think we can allow that to be a red herring around the fact that that's required. there are just so many gaps in the planning, in the services in our communities that the people who I honored to represent are really just not getting their needs met. And so that's a problem. And I don't know, I try not to bring problems that I don't have solutions to, but that's a big one, right?
Anyone else like to comment? Should someone have?
Lori, you started this whole session the last time we met, talking about the governor's speech, about, somebody mentioned this morning, system's not broken, it was never developed in the first place. I would hope this group, as someone's leaving the system, would give the boards the opportunity to plan the redevelopment of the system. So whatever that takes, I don't know, I don't have the answers, but I do know from a planning and funding, we need, right now, there's really no accountability. The biggest problem in our system is no accountability. When I have a family member call us and their loved one can't get care, and they don't, they end up somewhere, who's responsible for that? And if we really want the boards to have a function that helps those who are here to serve, I just hope that you give them, change this, whatever it takes, so that they can develop the system that we promised in 1988 for mental health and addiction even later. So that's kind of an overview. If we could use the governor's speech of redeveloping, fulfilling the promises, all the things he said in that, and give the boards the authority and the responsibility to fix it. And if they don't, have accountability with it.
Amanda, did you find it?
I always want to recognize that I serve Southeastern Ohio primarily. We are in Central Ohio now, and so I know that I've learned about different challenges as we go into different areas, but in serving Southeastern Ohio, I mean, I agree with what Terry just said, is that our boards work very collaboratively with us, and so the planning process, you'd have to create a whole nother system to bring providers together to say, where are the gaps, where do we need to build things together? I mean, I think what I speak to as we enter new counties is just having a way to assure that everybody's at the table to do that planning and to be part of the solutions. I think that as we enter new counties, what I experience sometimes is we're a new provider, so even though we're an established provider and we've been serving Ohio for a long period of time, I'm not really clear on what is the vetting process for the new boards that I enter into. Like, how do I prove myself? How do I, so I think what I'm looking for is a way of, the planning is important and the boards do a good job of that. A lot of the lack of resources I feel comes from, I mean, there's a lot of different factors on that. We've been asking for a resource. It's not that we haven't been asking or that the resources that we need haven't been pointed out. I think for me, it's just more as I enter new counties as a provider, how do I prove that I should have a seat at the table, and being able to know that and have something that says, you're doing this is our planning process, this is who's invited. I mean, I think that is something I'm looking for a little bit.
Yeah, Tracy.
I would like to offer I'm aware of the gaps in the system as a provider. I'm painfully aware of it because I can't fill the gaps. But the workforce shortage is going to get worse over the next decade. Job growth rate for counselors and social workers is at 43%, and that's unheard of. So, I mean, I think part of what needs to shift is I would like to see the boards, the idea of a competitive bid should be history, and it should be a collaborative bid. How can you as local providers work together to meet the needs and not compete with each other? We competed years ago when there were less clients and more providers. Now we have to collaborate because there's more clients and less staff. So 3 evenings, he shouldn't offer an evening IOP, for example, on the same 3 evenings, right? You know, things like that, that make common sense. So I mean, I think that if there's a shift in things, I'd like the planning to be more how, bring us all together and ask us to collaborate so that we can better meet the needs. And there's still gonna be gaps, but we're gonna get closer that way.
Dwayne,
You know, I can't speak for all boards, but I know for ours and a lot of the ones I talk to, that's exactly what's happening now. And we're having regular meetings saying, how are we gonna get through this workforce shortage? How are we gonna beat this? How can we serve clients better? And I think the great thing is people are starting to pull together. Of course, there's still no workers. But I think from what I see and the boards, other boards I talk to, we are working together, because if we don't do this together, we're never gonna get through it. And it's just, it just seems, it's not getting better. But it's just not our workforce, it's everywhere. I just, if somebody would tell me what these workers went, I just can't figure it out. I mean, from the service industry all the way up. And, but, you know, the only thing that's happening now is providers, and we're trying to deal with this, workers are just jumping from provider to provider. And I guess it's American, you can go wherever you want, but that's the biggest challenge of trying to say, how can work together and we share staff, share services, but I hear what you're saying, and we're trying, it's just, it's the needs are great, and the workforce is just not there.
Samantha, could you use your microphone too, if you can? Thank you.
Yeah, every time I think it's turned on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo that. I mean, I think what we're looking for at this time is to shift the culture of, we're trying to compete for the funding that comes to the board. And I think the providers are having these, so I mean, I appreciate that sort of, you know, reframe in terms of, you know, even when we're building out services, we're like, okay, how can we build teams where you may have 2 staff, we have 2 staff, and we share a supervisor? You know, but as we're doing that work, what we've come up against is even the boards having what they need to sort of facilitate those conversations. And, you know, so, but I mean, I think that has to be the shift, like competitive bids where one, you know, we've approached some boards that have basically, we've come in to say, we would like to contract because we see we're serving a large number of individuals who are uninsured. Well, we've sort of maxed out on who we can contract with for that, right? And maybe that's true, but I think some actual, you know, I'd like to know what portion of the population am I, as an organization, are we serving as compared to other providers in the region that you're already contracted with? Because if you can demonstrate as a board, right, that these providers you're contracting with are covering the majority of your community, that makes sense, and we can sort of, we'll find other funding, right? But being able to have more than just a conversation around like, we're maxed out versus what makes sense, right? Who are the providers? How many covered lives are happening, right? And how do we actually make sense of the resources that we have as like a community of providers and not these just individual competitive bids? So I appreciate that.
Michael.
Yeah, since we're talking about the planning process and how providers establish relationships with boards and participate in the planning process, I just feel compelled to say that the persons with lived experience need to be involved in that process too, to help identify the gaps and shape the conversation.
Try again.
I think if you bring it closer to your mouth.
So I think the conversation we're having around collaboration and planning is really kind of, we have a great opportunity to rethink how we do community planning, how we think about the role and function. And this is kind of getting into the whole function of this chapter. And as we talked about it as kind of an industry on the providers, we've kind of come up with what we would like to see as kind of four key principles. And I love alliteration, so there are the C's, those the 4 C's. So I'll apologize for that now. But it really, and I don't think this will surprise you, but I think this is where we have an opportunity to figure out how do we best use our resources and think about community planning more broadly. Because I think sometimes what we do when we do community planning, we stay very insular and we think about really more the folks that we directly connect through the behavioral health system and not thinking about how we go that next circle out because that's where we can have some impact in hopefully reducing people having to spiral into the chronicity of their disease process. And some communities do this well, but it's not everywhere, and it's not necessarily a wholly ingrained process. It is more, well, you're in the tent and you're out of the tent, instead of it should be an open tent that anyone in the community can actively participate in. So the 4 Cs is community planning. So really that function and a clear description of what should that community planning process look like? How should it be structured? How should it, connect with other things like, we've got the whole, the CHIP and the CHAW and the SHIP and the SHAW, the State Health Improvement Plan, the Community Health Improvement Plan, so that we're aligning resources and using things more broadly. So you've got a really robust and transparent process, and people have access to what is that plan, because sometimes it's available and other times it's not. The next would be connecting, a role for connecting people, because one of the things, we get these calls, our members get these calls, somebody's looking for care and they don't even know what's available in the community. And so how do we have that connection piece where it's a robust list of all the available resources for somebody? That would be a great role for boards to have, to say, here's what's available, not just who we fund, but if you have this payer source, we know who you might be able to connect with. The next is convening. So it's really when there are problems, when there are identification, how do we convene people to make sure that we're developing those resources and bringing the right people to the table across the spectrum of the county, the community, or the region to be able to problem solve. And then the final one is what's already been talked about, which is collaborative payer. So that there's a payer relationship, but it's focused on collaboration about how do we fill gaps, how do we meet that needs. That if we had if the duties were aligned around that, I think that's a real patient-centered, person-first service design that really starts to then build a process to be able to best use the limited resources we have, because the workforce shortage is real, and we're very grateful for the work that we're doing to try to address that. But we're going to have to deal with this in the long term. So how do we work collaboratively, providers, boards, and other system partners to make sure that we actually have plans that align those resources in a way that makes sense for the community?
So thank you for all that. Do any of our virtual participants have any comments on this topic? I'm gonna check in with you. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Amy. So, whoops, now of course my dogs are gonna start to bark, but, some of the thoughts that I was having at the early part of the conversation, people raised those folks with lived experience. And I also want to raise the people that are not accessing services as key to the conversations. I know that it's super challenging to think about adding more people to a system that is experiencing staff shortage. And I hear that in the conversations that are occurring. Yet, these are the folks that are getting lost and are in need of services and have not yet been connected. And when I think about these groups of people, I think about those people from marginalized populations and the system not meeting like the diverse cultural needs of folks. And then also last time we met, we talked about those folks with severe and persistent mental illness where engagement is an ongoing challenge for them. Often throughout their career, they come in and out, and it's really hard to keep them engaged. And so from a provider board standpoint, figuring out how to build up that end of the system that used to be pretty robust. And it's waning because it does take a lot more person power to work with that population. I don't know if you could hear me. I could also type
Yeah,
it in.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. I see a hand from Dustin. Dustin, go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to,
Stay back. Get back.
okay. I just wanted to reiterate and kind of give some emphasis to what Teresa was saying, because that it is so important. We recognize it in where from our seat in the theater of how we serve the patients that we serve, clients, patients. We're about one aspect of their life. We're an important aspect of their life, but everything they need, they can't get from us. Everything they, from a standpoint of even services, if their insurer is not someone we take, they need to get to somebody who can provide that care. So I think that connecting piece is critical, and it's not being done by anybody well. And most people, when they have something come up in someone they love, someone who comes to them and says, I need help, the first response isn't confidence in how you're going to respond. It's fear in, oh my God, I'm supposed to know this. And you know that the system is difficult to navigate from within. What is it like for those patients and clients needing the care, not knowing how impactful their insurance is? And the Adams system, the board system, impacts a small portion of the whole community, and not in a bad way, not in a very good way. But most of the care provided in our communities is not provided by providers like us. It's provided by non-board contracted providers. How are we connecting those individuals to those providers? Or does it just simply stigmatize the system, the boards and the providers, that we can't get people into care? When for most of the people needing care, they actually need to go someplace else first. But we don't have a system that's designed to do that, that's designed to really get the person needing care to the place that can provide it pursuant to the contract of insurance they have with who they have it with or not. A lot of the issues I hear us talking about, housing, connecting people to care, are not issues that are necessarily endemic to our system. They're greater societal issues that have such a profound impact on the people we serve that we have no choice but to grapple with them and try to solve them. This is one of those that I think is critical. The connecting piece and the community planning piece is a crucial part of what frankly, I think only boards can be providing. Maybe in the connecting, we could have a third party do it, but it is such a critical place to know what exists and how to get people to that care, and where it doesn't exist, how can we get that care into the community?
Thank you for that. I think that we'll throw it through.
Yeah, so Dustin, thank you. As this group thinks about that comment and section 340, what does that mean? We were starting with the planning conversation. Dustin, are you linking that to greater system planning? I don't want to put you on the spot, but how does the group think about that comment in relation to 340?
Well, this is Jamal. Based off of what Dustin and others have said, I think that the language or 340 would have to define what the lane and capacity of the board is. Really, what is their role in terms of engagement, closing gaps, oversight, and/or what their capacity is to help facilitate that. And what the Adams boards may do or not might be restrictive in closing gaps, providing funding, and ensuring that there's accountability. So does the existing language and my questioning provide opportunities for that, as well as the collaboration and opportunities to grow the ecosystem? Because the ecosystem of care is going to dictate where a patient client goes after they leave one of the agencies that are being funded, et cetera. So it can't just be exclusive to, I guess, the group that is working with the boards, but it needs to be inclusive of the impact of the work that is being done when the gaps are closed. And then I guess the accountability for me then comes in around, well, did the board do what it was intended to do for the client according to the mission, et cetera? So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's just what resonated with me after Dustin mentioned what he shared.
Sharon? And our mic's dead, by the way. The battery.
Yeah, it's on purpose, that's.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, to what Dustin, and even where Teresa started, when you talk about planning for the system, I mean, it brings two thoughts to my mind. One goes back to what Precious said, I think the first day we were here. If we only look at 340 as it is today and don't think about what's not there or what's bigger or what the system should look like, I think we're always going to be a little bit constrained with planning. And I think the same is true of partners. Like, we're talking about 340, but the reality is, and we're talking about, services provided, but FQHCs provide a lot of behavioral health care in this state. Hospitals provide a lot of health care in the state. Certainly the managed care organizations are the biggest payer of health care, behavioral health care. We need to figure out not only how to have them locally, but as we're having these larger discussions too, because I think if we really want to get to behavioral health care in the biggest part, and even as Dustin said, public behavioral health doesn't provide the majority of services. Our local docs do, our local hospitals do, a whole lot of other people. We have to think bigger than just what we have. And I don't know how we get to that, but I think in planning on the local system, we have to look bigger. And I think planning at the state level, we have to begin to look bigger. It's just a thought.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm
Sorry. I think I agree, I agree. But I also think we need to look differently. This is, we get really stuck in the way we always have planned. We do a SWOT analysis and we make sure that all the right people are at the table and we, think just how we've always done things. And perhaps we need to think more creatively and reach out to other systems, other systems, but other types of planning processes to get some creative juices flowing. I'm really, one of the ones that I think about is the art of hosting, which kind of helps to provide a really inclusive process and brings the right people together organically, not by saying, oh, you're right, but everyone who joins in the process and everyone who participates in the process, because it's a wide swath of invitations, becomes the right people at the table. It sounds a little, ethereal perhaps, or pie in the sky, but we've got to start thinking creatively. And I think that that's partly that has been running through my head through the entire crisis task force process and project, which, there's got to be workforce challenges then requires that we do cross training, and we don't have enough peer supporters in an area. Well, while we're building another recovery community organization, we should be, bringing more certified people in as a group for a temporary. I mean, we provide $10,000 signing bonuses to nurses because we don't have enough nurses. But I don't know that there's ever been a LCSW who's gotten a $10,000 signing bonus. They don't apply. So
yeah, I've offered one for almost a year and have 0 applicants.
A
$10,000 sign-on bonus for a crisis position, and I have 0 applicants.
So, okay, I stand corrected.
They don't apply and they don't exist. I would say that.
They don't exist either, because people haven't gone into the field for so long.
So then we need to get more creative than that. Okay, so the creativity is lacking, and it's partly because I'm, 35 years in this field, and so I'm exhausted from it, and I'm assuming that a lot of other people are as well. So, that's my soapbox for today, I guess, maybe for the minute.
Sure, question.
Oh, still on. Oh, I think I would go back to Terry's comment, which is about the issue of accountability. No matter who all we have in the room and what we do, the bottom line is if something's not there or something's needed, everybody can go like that, like who, like where, how do we strengthen the language to identify the point of accountability and what are the consequences if without that. What I want to say about planning is, there's community plans, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing or anything like that. But one of the things we need to keep in mind is that planning is a very fluid process. You need to be getting input anytime from anyone, anywhere, so that you're continuing to shape that. You can't limit it to document A. Not that you don't need document A, but you have, you can't hang your hat on a single document because planning is fluid. So I just think that no matter how big our tent is, no matter what our planning processes are, that like when I read the planning agency for the county under its jurisdiction, in our community, people infer that as you're the point of accountability from the sheriff, like, what are you doing about this today, to the police department, but perhaps that inference is interpreted differently places, and maybe we need more clarity there so that people know that. And if we aren't that point of accountability, then what's our authority to hold other people accountable? Like if it's supposed to be the managed care company, like what do we do? So, it's like you end up bouncing back and forth. Well, you paid for it, you're accountable. No, you need, it's like, how do we make that so that it is applicable? So I think about like a fire department that responds to a fire. Doesn't matter if it's a rich home, a poor home, a commercial property, it doesn't matter, they're responding to the fire. And so it's really clear where that point of accountability is, irrespective of income and that kind of thing. And so I think we need to think some way about how do we do that, knowing there are all these other payers out there. There are all these other people. Where is that locus of responsibility, and how do we make it stand up in law?
So I want to tie this also back to the continuum of care. Because I think that, when we talk about this, it is the, and I'm going to pick on words a little bit. We talked, and Sherry, you used the word the public behavioral health system. But I don't think that's actually what we talk about in the statute. The statute talks about a continuum of care, meaning across systems, not just what's publicly funded. So I think the piece for me is, you're right, community planning is not a one and done. It's the strategic vision of what do we have? What are the gaps, and what are we prioritizing to work on that's, the statute says in collaboration with the priorities set by the department. So this is what our framework is, and this is how we're moving forward. In the 4C model that I put forward, earlier, I think it's that convening piece, which some communities do really, really well. And so it's how do we pull that convening piece so that it's tied to that planning piece, so that when there are, circumstances, that's where you start to create that accountability, but it's a shared accountability. It's not any one person's direct responsibility. Because some of these things we're talking about are bigger than just the behavioral health system. There are bigger issues at place, but how do we have a focus point for responsibility for convening the right people, regardless of who it is? Maybe it is a payer, it is a managed care plan, it's, you know, the hospital, it's the sheriff, it's, you know, a local zoning board, it's whoever is involved. And some communities do this well, but others don't. And so how do we think about that as one of the primary responsibilities that is spelled out with kind of a framework of how that's done? That would be something in the statute that I think would be helpful, so that we're all working together and we understand if there's a problem, who's at least going to convene people to come up with it, knowing, you know, I don't want, board shouldn't be responsible for funding 100% of whatever needs to be done. That's not what anybody's saying. You have limited resources, but with those resources, how do we have a strategy for this is what we're doing, this is our plan, and then this is when there's problems, there's the.
So, Teresa,
Yeah, so we have first Jamal and then you, Sherry, thanks.
so I guess a recommended solution on a language change, just from listening, would be to go from continuum of care, which seems kind of lateral, to ecosystem of care, which is, you know, kind of circular, if you will, because that includes every partner in the provision of care and treatment. Patients, clients come into our system, but they never leave it. And, or they touch another component of care that is outside of our span of accountability or control. So I would say, you know, as we look at the language in the code, developing an ecosystem of care, to me, and I don't know the thoughts of others, it heightens the level of accountability, because it's just not the continuum. It's not where you go when you leave here and where you go from there. But when you come back, we need data. When you come back, we need to make sure that you're better than you were before you left, or there's other implications that go into that. So that ecosystem, to me, is a cycle, if you will, of communication between all partners, boards, providers, sub-provider care, you know, neighborhoods, et cetera, to ensure that the health of our community improves, particularly those who are marginalized and underrepresented. And I think with that approach, and you put that into language, now we have some accountabilities that everybody can agree to, even if it's not directly impacting them.
Thank you. Sherry?
You know, somebody brought up the chip and the shopping, it might have been Teresa earlier, and many of our boards are involved in those. In fact, I'd say maybe more often than not. But it seems like in this role that somehow we have to get some of those other players at the table as well. But for behavioral health specifically, for the community, I mean, that does seem to be a primary role of the boards, and I think that's part of the purpose of the boards, and I think we would say that should continue to be a purpose of the board, is to be that convener and bring all those people to the table to do the planning. But I think we may need to look at a bigger picture of who all those players are.
You know what, I think we're gonna go ahead and break for lunch. Can you hold your thought, Dwayne? And we're gonna pick up this discussion afterward. So I appreciate, this has been really, I think, a very good discussion, both on recovery housing and on the board powers and duties. So thank you. We will reconvene, we will target 12:15 for that, for our online. So we'll see you back then. Thank you. Oh, yes. Oh, I just want to make an announcement. The lunches are in room 1101. So we will pick them up over there. If you need a reminder of what you ordered, I have a spreadsheet of that. So, and then we have bottles of water here for drinks. Thank you.
If you're joining us remotely, we'll reconvene at
12:15.
12:15. Yeah, sorry, then don't forget to mute your mic and maybe turn off the camera while you're away and click on back. Thank you.
I don't know how you know.
I think they turn us on if there's a, just has to be.
So we're gonna go
It's not
ahead and get started. I know members are still finishing their lunches and that's certainly fine. But we'll just keep the discussion going. So we're returning again to our topic of board duties and powers. And we would like to move in to finding out what you believe about the board, what should be the board's function with evaluating, investigating, reviewing, auditing, those functions. I'm gonna try to group them together. There's a pretty lengthy list there of 14. So thinking of, again, those, the evaluating, investigating, reviewing, and auditing, can you get your thoughts on those functions? Jamal, did you want to share anything on that?
No, I'm sorry. That is from our previous
That's
session.
from there.
I wasn't able to lower it. But actually, I do need to jump off here soon as well because I have a graduation event getting ready to start shortly. So
Okay.
take care, everyone. Have a blessed rest of your day.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'll be brave.
You'll be brave. Okay, thanks, Samantha.
I mean, can't never get this thing staff. I guess I would need to sort of understand, I mean, I think as a behavioral health organization and even housing, right, we have all of these entities that are holding us account, right? CARB, we talked about CARB. I don't know all the rules, like fair housing rules, like HUD, everything that we're doing has this layer of accountability and, ways for if we're not taking care of people or we're not doing the things that we need to, like there are mechanisms within those accreditation and certification processes that keep us accountable. So I think, in order to respond to that, I would sort of need to better understand historically what was the value added by additional investigation or these different roles on top of what we're already experiencing.
Yep, Tracy.
So I will be brave also and echo those concerns. These expectations are duplicative and very burdensome administratively to providers. When you go through national accreditation standards, those are very intensive reviews. We're all required to conduct fiscal audits, those are very extensive processes as well. With the Ohio Department of Medicaid, they're watching our claims and doing statistical analysis for outliers and potential risks of fraud. And then to have additional reviews conducted by the board that create more time on the agencies when we don't have the time. And I really think it goes back to sort of this entire, the whole, ORC 340 section, that everything has to be done with the idea of how can we meet our expectations in the most streamlined manner possible. Agencies don't have resources to be data systems. We have a lot of report expectations that are very burdensome to collect the data, even if you have an EMR. Not all agencies have the resource of internal IT to develop those reports, so there's cost for creating them. We're already giving OBIS data, for example, to show something about our outcomes, and I think there's opportunities there to use data we're already submitting to measure services and benchmark against like providers. So I really think that this is a problematic area at the provider level.
Sure, Sherry.
We're talking specifically just the investigating, right?
That's one of them, yes.
Yeah, I mean, for boards, I think the issues, and I'm just speaking in the bigger picture here, they can certainly speak up, but oftentimes it's a board who will get a call from county commissioner, whoever, that somebody's made a complaint. Boards are on the ground they're in the local community. So, I mean, we talked about, and I think in the last budget, maybe it's 2 budgets ago, I can't even remember, where there was an ability for boards to be kind of advocates for people, particularly people getting Medicaid. So I think boards are the folks on the ground that can see and hear what's occurring. So I get that you don't want to, and I'm only talking about the investigating abuse and neglect. I'm not talking about anything else. But I think if they get that kind of complaint, I think being on the ground in the community, it does make sense for them both.
And I was speaking more to the reporting and auditing,
Okay.
you know, not the complaints.
Yeah, I think the community has to have a place that they know about that is actually in their community. To be able to go to and say, here's an issue and I need for you to investigate this. And so they need to be an investigating body. Or the, you know, or whoever else is assigned to do that needs to be on the ground in the community. The people that are being served would not know about, to be able to go to call for any of those governing or certifying entities. It does seem like if you're already nationally certified, that that national certification body would be the visiting and evaluating component, and that makes perfect sense. But, and I will say right now that I hear from the front lines that the investigating component is fraught with politics. And so there, we do need to look at some of the conflicts of interest that may exist around the, you know, the boards being the investigating body. I think that they do need to be, but I also have heard that there are challenges in that process where responses, you know, in small communities, if I know somebody and they're a friend of mine, I can't possibly believe that they might be, you know, needing to be investigated for anything over here. So that would be an area that I think I would raise a concern around.
Justin?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I try to ask myself is, I don't want to say slay the myths or slay the assumptions, but whom and why? So in this case, earlier we were talking about accountability. Well, accountability is a term that means a lot of things to a lot of people. I think it's important when we use it, we think about accountability for what, to whom, and in this case, you know, audits for what, for to prove what, to establish what. We need to ask those questions. I do it with my staff. I do it with my family. Try to really get at, why are we really doing this? What is the real answer we need to get to? Because if, say for investigations, investigate who? Well, if it's only investigating the community behavioral health system, to the outside world, it looks like the community behavioral health system has a problem. It needs to be investigated. Is all providers, are all providers being investigated? Private docs, individuals providing mental health services, whether they be at a board contracted agency or not, that is a much different view. And step back, why is the investigation power not in the same hands as the accrediting and or certifying body? OMAS has a investigations arm. They actually go in, they look, they do it. Why do we have two? All of these things add complexities for two reasons. One, cross-county complexities. So earlier in this conversation, talked about a provider most providers provide services in multiple counties. Now you've got, how do you deal with that? With a body who isn't the body who actually provides you the certification. I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be oversight. I just think we need to ask why, and is it in the right place?
Thank you. Pressure?
I would just point out that you cannot do good planning without data and information. So I think that there's a potential opportunity where, yes, providers meet lots of requirements for other bodies. How available is that to a board? How accessible is the Medicaid information, the billing information, the so on and so forth? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't do good planning without good information. Information has to come from somewhere. If I think that there's always that threshold of, is it critical that we have this? And always asking that question. How does this piece of data help us get to some kind of predictive analytic that might help our system? But that word data is really important in terms of the board being in the loop to be able to access the data. Because if otherwise, without good data, you're not going to have good planning. There's qualitative input is wonderful, and you have to have it, but it has to be balanced with quantitative information.
Tracy. Big question. I'll just go back and forth. So I agree that data is needed as part of the board's, required duties. But I don't agree that providers are the source of the data. If you need Medicaid data, that should be a discussion with the Department of Medicaid. And providers should not be put in the position of providing it simply because a rule would allow for that to happen. I also think a lot of these rules were written when community behavioral health agencies started and were primarily board-funded entities. And, now the Ohio Council recently, did a survey and board funding is less than 20% of the revenue base of most community behavioral health agencies. So a lot has shifted, and a lot of these rules ask for 100% of the business to be accountable to the boards, even though they fund 20% of it. And so I think that overall we need to consider that shift when we're looking at the rules, but it is very frustrating when Medicaid data is needed and we're the source of that when we have a Department of Medicaid.
Are you saying that they're requesting the accountability of your whole organization? I guess why wouldn't you want to provide Medicaid information?
Because why should I pay an IT person to develop those reports? And then every board, we have 4 board contracts. Every board will want something different. So I have to develop and produce 4 different reports on whatever schedule because I accept Medicaid.
That makes some sense. I think I appreciate saying that and I would know how you would plan in the community if you don't know who your Medicaid clients are being provided already to. That's
right. The Department of Medicaid can provide that data. They have all kinds of information, county of residence, service codes, all of that. And so that's why, that needs to be the source.
And we would be happy with that.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
Very upfront that we would like access to Medicaid data for the things, because I understand where you're coming from. So we're having ongoing conversations with the Department of Medicaid in Ohio, Recovery Ohio, and the department. And so we've been very clear about that. I think the other thing is, you're right, things have changed since '88. There is no doubt about it. And it's how do we figure out what's relevant today in terms of planning, administering, and oversight. What does that mean? But I'll just give you a different example. Boards, and we've been kind of open about this too. We don't want to be a certifying body. We do not want to be a certifying body. Let's be real clear about that. But we'd like to know when people are certified or when new people come in the community, because we have instances where a new provider will open up and a board won't know about it until after the fact. Maybe there's a concern that's raised or something like that. We don't want to be certifying, but let us be in the loop to know what's going on. If there's an investigation that the department is doing, just let us be in the loop, because we are on the ground. But I don't want anybody, we don't want to be certified. We just want to be more in the loop. So as we're planning, we can figure out what that means in our system here. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but there does have to be some change. We agree with you. And I don't know what that mix is. I honestly can't sit here today and say, we should do this, we shouldn't do that. But we have to figure out how are we in the loop without having more authority in that area, it's just making sure we're part of being able to get.
And I do want to say, I do understand about new providers coming to the area. You know, we have, new providers who come in and say, oh, by the way, Firelands, we're going to send you all our medication patients because we opened up shop, but we don't have a psychiatrist. And I say, well, Firelands can't do that for you, so I'm sorry you didn't plan ahead for that, you know. Or we have recovery housing that comes in and they'll take individuals from counties all across Ohio who need psychotropic medication, and they'll say, well, we just took this person from whatever county and she's going to be out of meds tomorrow, so have her see a doc today. Oh, right, yes, I had that available, just no. So I think there does need to be coordination. I agree with that.
Yeah, coordination, whoops, is that, oh, well. Yeah, I agree, coordination is important. It is on? Yeah. Oh, I'll stop yelling. I do think that, technology, I mean, I was just thinking about this and made a comment about this earlier. I think that, that we need as a field to embrace technology because it could be, a really significant answer to and solution to some of the challenges. I understand that, especially for providers that having to do dual entry and having to do the things that came up first when technology was first coming out, when EHRs were first coming out, can still be an issue. But we have to, as a field, fight against that with the technologists. Because that's not a problem of the requirement for reporting. That's a problem of the technology. So if we embrace technology, our lives will become so much easier.
Okay, comments to this?
I'm not very technical, so you'll have to bear with me for a minute. So first, a couple of things that come to mind. First, I want to address technology. I absolutely agree. And the one common ground that I will say that we have with our providers, as well as the rest of the community, is the fact we have no technology and we don't have the resources to put the right infrastructure in place. And the prime example was that crisis data survey that we had to do. I had multiple people that were so happy to give me data and information, but everybody had to hand count everything, which was just amazing, and the commitment to that because they wanted something better for their community. So they were willing to put the time and effort into place for that. But then really taking a hard look at that to think, wow, what do we really need so we can communicate with each other? So that we can collect data that's really important to planning, that we can collect data that shows taxpayers that we're using the money that they're providing to us in ways that make sense to them as a community that we can explain. And so I think about, it's called HIT, Health Information Technology. There's actually some evidence-based practices out there. HRSA has done a very nice job in putting out, particularly for the rural communities, what some of those are. And it's a fairly new way for us to think about things, but we need help with that. It's more than one thing to say you should do a better job communicating with each other. Well, we need the money to develop those processes. We need training, we need technical assistance, and we need some direction with that. And I think that would help a lot of this conversation if we could just figure out how to do some of that. It's not going to solve all our problems, but I think it's something that would be helpful.
Michael Matoni.
Yeah, this is a really good discussion. I just think that some of these areas are really need to be more narrowly defined. They're way too broad. For example, I would never let somebody from Aetna come into my service area and start looking at clients that were covered by a different insurance. You know, that's just unthinkable. You know, things like investigating abuse and neglect complaints, that's way too broad. Cooperating with OMAS in visiting and evaluating, way too broad. Program audits for the services that are provided, definitely. I mean, I see that as a function of the board. But you know, conducting fiscal audits, you know, again, I think we got to be cautious there about how that is really narrowly defined. And I think one of the comments made about the percentage of services that are actually funded within certain programs by the board. Thank you.
Tom?
Sorry, I can't get my internet back on, but my comment is that the information has been referred back to be needed for planning process. And I think if we really took a look at developing a collaborative process in terms of community planning, then the needed information will be brought into that collaborative meeting or partnership. I think that the line that Mike talks about is that there's a fine line between collaborating and finding the community needs versus looking at managing, micromanaging. And we as organizations have evolved and have run, I believe most of us run very good business practices. Most of us pass our annual fiscal audit with no findings. I think that some of the tools that are already there, some of the measures that are there should be utilized as evidence that we are running a good business and that there be some trust that would bring us back into the collaborative process with the boards. We should be partners with the boards. I don't know how else to say it. I think we need to be partners.
Yeah, I kind of want to build on that because I think when we go back and look at when this section of the statute was written, the boards were responsible for Medicaid. And so a lot of what we still focus in terms of the way we manage and relate is based on Medicaid requirements. But Medicaid isn't the responsibility of the board, and the programmatic issues have shifted. Providers today, on average, contract with 35 different payers. So we have a very different experience around what program audits look like and what financial audit look like. And what we hear consistently is that the expectation, the time and the effort in the amount of program review of what feels like executive management that should be the responsibility of the provider organization's board is the role of the add-on board. And so that's not their job. You know, we contract with multiple managed care companies. They don't ever ask me to produce a copy of my monthly financial statements. They don't ask me to produce a lot of the documents that are assumed that I'm managing because I'm an accredited organization, I'm certified. And that's what adds to the burden. And providers spend a great deal of time, energy, and effort managing responsibilities for a contract that for most of them is less than 20% of their total revenue. And so how do we move beyond that? How do we plan using aggregate data? It's not individual provider data. I don't give information to Buckeye Health Plan for a client who's served by CareSource. I don't feel that as a patient, I should give information to an add-on board if they're not part of the payer for the services they're receiving. That's the boundary that we've set around healthcare. You know, as a community provider, we don't know when another doctor's office is open or when another healthcare entity opens. So how do we start to work collectively around some of these issues? But go back to that framework around community planning, connecting, and convening, and then really look at reducing the burden so that the contracting and the expectations, particularly around auditing. You know, I do an independent financial audit. If I get more than $750,000 of federal grant money, I have to do an independent audit. So I'm audited. That should be good. I do a 990 if I'm a nonprofit. That should meet the test of the fiscal responsibility, not have another entity that comes in and spends a day wanting to review all of my internal processes. So those are some of the changes. When we get an audit from, a managed care plan, they're going to request maybe 10 records. And I'm going to send them the information electronically. There's not an on-site process that takes a lot of time, effort, and energy. So how do we start to move this system to something that's based much more consistent with the rest of the contracts that providers experience?
Well, I think that I do think that that somebody needs to be going on site occasionally. Speaking as from a person served perspective, I need for I need for somebody to be looking at the facility, and I know that it does happen. But I don't need 4 different entities to do that, or 10 different entities. However, I will say that, again, albeit the technology drum, when I've been in charge of CARP accreditation, I gave them, you know, my information on a USB drive, right? And they reviewed all of that. However, then they did have to look at the facility. The bottom line is that for me, from a technology perspective, all of the reports can come out of the same database. And if you have access to pull the right reports from that single data system, then it doesn't have to be a burden for the provider providing the data. But I also really adamantly disagree that you can do community planning without data.
Is that Robin?
One.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, Bobby, and then we'll go.
It's okay. I want to say, and not just saying this to suck up, so to speak, but we have a really wonderful relationship with our board. We've been incredibly collaborative with them to really improve what we do for our community. But we provide data ad infinitum, and probably to the state as well, that I'm not always clear that anybody ever looks at. And you know, maybe this goes back to your technology, but I don't have any problem, frankly, having technology or providing some agreed upon data pertinent to the services that are funded by the board. I mean, I don't have any problem with that. It's just, I don't feel like, if you could see the reports, we do a quarterly report, we do a year-end evaluation, and it goes on and on from there. And I just don't feel like that data is looked at in any kind of way that does inform the community planning process. Now, you know, we have conversations and things like that where it happens, but aren't necessarily, I mean, are data driven to a point. But I think it needs to be a well-defined set of data, and not continually be added to or asked for again. And in our organization, 6% of our funding comes through the board, less than 20% comes through if you add all the grants and the pass-through funds that are coming through as well. So, you know, the world is changing, and there was certainly a different time with that.
I'm not sure what I have to say is that relevant at this point, but I guess I'm sitting here from my little corner down in the pocket of the state wondering, is this really what happens everywhere? Because this is not how we treat our agencies. And I do accept their audits. I accept their CARF accreditations. I don't go in and spend a day doing what CARF has already done, or what the state auditors have already done, or whoever the auditing entity is. So I guess the way we view our role is that we're accountable to our local community. That, you know, if I'm going to go in and look at conditions or something like that, it's on behalf of somebody who's being served by that agency and their family is called and is concerned, or something like that, or a judge, or a county commissioner, or a school superintendent, or a Department of Health director, or a DJFS director. We're answering to all of them at the county level. And that's where, I guess most of the time, I don't feel a sense of authority as much as I feel a sense of responsibility back to the community to offer to offer something up that is meeting needs in a variety of ways. But I do have the luxury of being in a small community. So families know where our door is and they come. Many of them have my cell phone number, and almost everybody else in the world does too. And, but that's okay, because I believe that accessibility is what people need. If our role is to make sure there's a quality system of care that meets at one level the needs of the other services, the other service providers, or the rest of the provider community. Also, then we have this level where I'm trying to do no harm to the agencies who are trying to survive and serve people. Sam and I are looking at each other across the way. She's one of the agencies that I work with. But, you know, when we look even at the contracting process, which is not part of today, but without a local levy, if I'm going to do anything different in a contract, then I have to look at doing no harm to an agency. So we see our role very much as helping them. Sam and I had a conversation before this meeting started this morning about the way I knew another agency was doing something that possibly they could just join together and meet this need, and that's the way we do it. And then always underlying is the great need in our community. People need our services. And so how are we always making sure that, yeah, because there are predator providers out there. There are some really bad things happening, and referenced earlier, Portsmouth and you know, those communities are in my back door. I know that stuff is happening. And when you have these poverty-ridden Appalachia, you know, all the things that go on down there in communities without infrastructure, when somebody comes in and does something like really shoddy housing or, you know, sets up something like that, the entire community is affected in a way that they often can't overcome. And so you see things like these reactions from county commissioners and city councils and all of that, because we've added to their burden. And then this is where the call comes, at least in small communities. And so that role of providing that oversight or evaluating effectiveness can be done in a way that's just responsible back to people, and not about lording something over or creating something so burdensome that it's difficult to do your job.
Sure, I'm gonna go to Dustin online and then I'll come back to you. Dustin?
Thank you. The two things, the initial thought I would have is who's investigating those bad providers? Because in essence, what we do is the providers who are likely doing the right thing are those that are facing the greatest administrative burdens, the greatest, and those who aren't caring and aren't doing the right thing probably are getting around them and probably aren't being asked the questions they need to be, and aren't the ones who really should be under the scrutiny. That in the instance of saying we're doing something, we actually put the good providers. And so we spend our time often on addressing that because we do care, right? And meantime, that's hiring administrative folks over clinical folks. It's hiring administrative folks over medical folks. So how are we meeting our missions when we're ever increasingly having to address administrative burdens that really are problems that are elsewhere in the system? One of the things I wanted to say was data is close to my heart, and it's one of the pillars of our strategic plan as an agency is data and data-driven decisions. We are behind you 100% on data. But what kind of data? How is it collected, and how is it used? One of the things that we've experienced in participating not only in our own internal journey on this, but also externally through data transparency initiatives, working with other providers, that A does not equal A, because we all collect it differently. We all do something differently. It's ask for, we may think it's a simple ask, gender. Let me tell you, gender and reporting on gender is no simple task, because everybody has a different data definition. Everybody wants it differently. Ethnicity as well. And so how do you crosstab? How do you collect the information at the beginning to be able to answer the easy question on who? Because it's not easy. And so often when you have providers who are saying, this is a hard ask, and you're thinking, we're just asking their gender. It's a hard ask because other people may want it differently, and we may have already recorded it differently, which may mean we can't actually give you anything other than a best guess derived from the previously recorded information. So getting common data definitions where we all agree how we're going to collect information so that when we look at it, we actually know we're looking at apples and apples is I think it would be a long way to go versus having, 55, 60, some asks that are all different, similar, but different. So it's kind of a hidden problem, but it is what causes a lot of the problems with data is what do you mean by, what is the definition of this? We spend a lot of time on it.
Terry, did you have a comment? Go ahead and mention.
Yeah, I just, the conversation's been really good. Tracy, you said something that has been a bug for 340 for a long time with me. And that is, person moves into high recovery in your community and they come and want you to serve them. I don't think because a person has a mental illness or a substance abuse problem, that they don't have a right for treatment or the right to live wherever the hell they want to live. And we have to have something in 340 that gets away from this territorial that I live in Franklin County. I can't go to the Cleveland Clinic and have care and then decide I want to be near my doctor and live there and be turned away, because we turn away people who are not in my county of jurisdiction. So just for the record, if we could find some way in 340 to find funding or whatever, or requirement that we have some kind of way of
Reciprocity or something.
reciprocity, whatever the purpose is, I think that's an important, it's been for 50, since the act, territorial has been a terrible issue because it's not the agencies or it's not the boards, it's the client. No, you can't get service in my county. That just makes no sense to me. Thank you.
Sure, Sherry.
I have a couple of different thoughts here. On data, to start with the comment, Tom, I think you made, I think it is more than just planning that folks want data for. They get calls when there are emergencies, when we see a suicide trend, when we see an overdose trend, when we see those kind of things, and we need access to data. And we are talking, we agree that providers should not have to provide data in 55 different ways. We're with you, which is why we believe if we could get it from the Department of Medicaid, then we shouldn't be asking you for it. We should be able to go get the data we need and be able to use it as we need. And we're talking not just aggregate, we are talking data, but our boards are HIPAA covered entities. I mean, they get data from other places. They know how to handle data. So I know we're not always on the same page on that, but we don't want providers to have to get 5 requests from 5 different boards or from whomever else. But we get asked for data from folks like county commissioners. And I mean, I'll give you a prime example with these opiate lawsuits that have been going on up north. We've had board directors spending hours and eons with their providers trying to collect the data that's needed by the county commissioners to be able to move forward. So sometimes if we just had access to data, I think that would be helpful and it would be easier on you from where we sit. I think the other thing I just want to talk about is, I think also boards certainly understand as a whole that everybody is overburdened with all kinds of administrative stuff. We all get that. We really do. And so, are there ways we could streamline some of that? Yeah. But I think what we have to remember, there is a difference. We're different than Medicaid. We're different than Aetna. We're a government entity, and we have to be responsible for government funds. And maybe we ask for a report at the end of the year or something like that. But I mean, it's just like the department comes in and looks at boards and does stakeholder reviews. And I'm not complaining, I'm just saying they're government and they have to look at us. We're government and we have to look at how we spend our dollars. And so we're not trying to be overly intrusive, but we are trying to do what is our responsibility and make sure that we can report back to the community, report back to the state what we're doing and how the dollars are being spent, but also how the clients are being served, because I think it is all about going back to clients. And if there are ways that jointly we can figure out how to do that easier, I think we'd be all about it. as long as we still make sure that we have the ability to do our role.
Sure, Tom first, yeah.
Shirley and Robbie, thank you for what you said, because I think that's meaningful and helpful. And it is a reminder that there are some very good boards and provider relations. And I've mentioned to you, Sherry, that we're in multiple counties. And in some of those counties, we have a great relationship with the board, and some of them we don't. And it becomes extremely burdensome when I have to respond to multiple different requests for what could be similar information, but not. And so if there could be some conformity or uniformity in terms of a reporting mechanism that truly prioritizes what is necessary for us to proceed, suicide trends, overdose trends. Nobody's going to disagree with that in terms of recognizing what will be critical information. But that's not always the information that's asked for. And if we can come up with a standard that makes sense for all involved, it truly is moving towards a collaborative planning process. I don't think we'll get much resistance from any of us.
Okay, I just want to piggyback on that because I think it'd be interesting. I don't know if you guys have ever done a survey to see what is collected from board to board. But I mean, some of the things that are asked for are incredibly detailed, overreaching. And again, it's not every board, but it might be interesting if you knew, and maybe you've done that, some idea from board to board, what is requested.
We have not.
Tracy, I know you have a comment.
Well, I just wanted to clarify in the scenario I was giving about the recovery housing, it wasn't that the person was from Franklin County. That was just an example, but it's the lack of planning. So there's no collaboration with us in the recovery housing, and then to call us and want medication access the same day, that's just not something we have the capacity to provide. But Terry, you do bring up a good point because, we are in the land of Cedar Point and we get tourists from all over. And sometimes individuals then stay, in Erie County and or temporarily are with someone in Erie County staying for the week, for example, and they have a crisis. And yes, any board will pay for the crisis service, but then when we contact the home board and we say this individual's indigent and they need hospitalized somewhere, well, you would need a contract with us for that. And it's like, today, I'm gonna get a contract today. And then what comes along with a contract to serve this person who's in need right now? So I do think if we could free up something around how that works to make it easier when we're just trying to get the person served.
Appreciate that. Let's fix it. You're right.
Yeah.
So can we shift a little bit with that comment?
Was there any last comment on that? So I think, yeah, we should shift our.
So just thinking about all the words that involves so many constituents. And thinking about Tracy, that crisis doesn't always occur right or in your home. It can occur anywhere.
Yeah.
Make sure they should getting better. I can't speak. Lisa can see. Okay. So thinking about access to inpatient care for psychiatric crisis, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, how the system works or doesn't work right now in these scenarios. I think we're going to see more of that with more coordinated crisis efforts across the state. And I know within our hospital system, we have a lot of collaboration with boards and providing access to care. Discharge planning is also something that needs to be considered so that people aren't just, leaving either or right now, there's language and statute around boards and responsibility. talk a little bit about that in terms of, back to Terry, coming, who do we want to be moving forward, not how do we react to what's written for today.
I'm so sorry.
I was muted.
Okay.
Is it Amy by any chance?
Are there multiple? Okay. No, are there multiple mics on around the table? Because I wonder if that's.
Did you have a hard time hearing?
Just the very end of your question.
Well, I'd like us to talk about, I know we referenced a couple of times that we don't want to just react to what's written in statute. We want to think about what could be, and then how would we write statute around that, or what would need to be in code. So thinking about crisis services, accessing the right level of care, and that level of system collaboration that's needed to help people choose where they want to go without feeling like a commodity or being bottlenecked somewhere. How do we do that in relationship with providers and boards and state hospitals, and private patient access too? So I'm thinking really right now, let's focus on adults with serious mental illness, just to put a topic on the table, and accessing inpatient care, whether it's because they have a civil commitment or because they've been recommended that level of care.
Lori, when the Mental Health Act was passed in 1988, the boards were responsible for, as a matter of fact, the heart of that bill was we were not going to have a hospital system and a community system. We were going to merge those communities together. And the boards were responsible to pay at the hospital for any client that they sent to the hospital. I'm still not sure why that was changed, but from a standpoint of accountability of a client getting services, if a board has a client that needs to be in a hospital, then they pay for it. And we would know then that the client's getting the service. Today, where is accountability? If the board has a client that needs a service, and in many cases the hospital's full, we have to send them to one of these boutique hospitals. They don't get the service they may need. So why did we change that? And maybe we need to change it back, where the boards are responsible for inpatient care for the chronically mentally ill in their community.
So Terry, is that regardless of payer? Because I think that's
I think the vast majority that when the mental health was passed, we didn't have the Medicaid back then that we have now.
But I think that becomes one of the big questions is we have a different payment structure.
Absolutely.
And from a parity perspective, every single insurance company should be paying for the service, period. And then for those who don't have, or, the issue where it gets murky is where there's a civil commitment, or you have an NGRI. And so those questions become, I think those are that's a different level of care and a different level of judicial involvement that we have to think through. But I think that's part of why some of that changed. And it also, from a budgeting perspective, created a dedicated line to make sure that hospital services were funded and that counties didn't get shifted so that then if they had one or two really high cost, high need people, their entire resource got stripped away. So I think that's the why. So the question really is, from my mind, is how do we create the coordination and the connection for discharge planning? Because I think we do a pretty good job of getting people in with the limited resource. We don't know if we don't have enough or not, because I don't think we have a good handle on the community capacity beyond the state system. We know the state system is taxed because of the misdemeanor competency and some of the other forensic issues that we still need to make progress on. We have more to do. But how do we then create that discharge connection, and what's the responsibility, not just of the community system, but of the hospital? Because too many times what I hear, and I'm sure people hear this, is a person gets discharged to the park bench outside the facility for waiting for a bus or a taxi or someone to come pick them up. And
Shame
that's a
on us.
problem.
Shame on us.
But how do we solve that discharge piece and how do we have a role, again, you know, that's another one of those connection pieces. Because I think that's the area where we kind of fall apart, because we do have different people and different players involved in the services, particularly with inpatient today.
Okay. So I would say, Teresa, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, but I think I'm also going to go back to people's access to that service to begin with. You know, there are times we can have all the money in the world and we may have somebody who has some very challenging needs that nobody will take. And they spend days in emergency departments. And these are people that legitimately need a higher level of care and need a higher level of treatment that are not going to be well treated, that are not going to be appropriately treated in the community. So I think overall, we have to look at it as an issue at hand as to who's accountable and how is it that we have people have the right type of service at the right time. And then who makes those final decisions about how that ends up working. And I would hope that it would be that person whose care that we are talking about.
Sure, Joy. The only thing I want to say to that is, and earlier we talked, I think the board's the convener. And in our county, we had to start a relationship with a hospital. So we established a hospital navigator. That's a mandated position now. So nobody should be discharged from the hospital without at least having an appointment. I'd prefer them seeing the provider, but an appointment. So the provider works with the navigator, and the navigator at present employed by the hospital, the board pays for, but in the past, they've been paid for by a provider that we paid for. But there needs to be the connector to the community, because if any of you ever had any family in the hospital, it's a nightmare. And if you don't have an advocate, you might as well go home, all right? So we gotta make it better for people. And so we have, like right now, we have a relationship with the hospital that this navigator, her job, and I call her all the time and say, well, what's going on with this? The other nice thing this position does is hospitals talk better to hospitals. So someone's coming in from Franklin or Cuyahoga County, you touch base with this navigator, because I don't want somebody hitting a park bench. It's not acceptable, and it's just not gonna happen. And when someone's responsible, I'll guarantee the person not gonna be a park bench, because I get someone to call. So I just think it's, you know, when we were talking about convening, I don't think we can be the response. The problem's too big for behavioral health, but we're supposed to be the ones that convene. And just, if I get a second, we had a tragedy in our community 2 weeks ago, and a young man took his life in school in front of everybody. And the provider called me, and we convened like an emergency meeting. And at that point, the education system was the lead. We said, okay, how can the rest of us help you? Then behavioral health backed them up, and the providers were the boots on the ground, and we got through it. But at that point, it was beyond me with the school system what to do. They were in charge. We've had other situations. You know, we had a provider that the department closed, and rightfully so. And at that point, the department called, and we said, okay, how can we help? And it was all of our providers called and said, we can do this, we can do that. And we were the connector, we were the convener. We didn't do anything. I just see us as an important part of the cog, but maybe not always the lead, but just the one, we make sure it gets done, you know. And so, and if it doesn't get done, then it's the board directors to call and say, there's a problem here, you know. And all we answer to the county. We have all kind of bosses. I always say, Lori's my boss, but I get 3 county commissioners too, and I have 18 board members, and you got to keep everybody happy. And I have a county commissioner, and God bless her, she'll on the phone at 9 o'clock at night and say, this woman, I heard this, blah, blah, blah. You know, so I call the health commissioner, but I think navigators are so important. I mean, it's a word we're throwing around, but we have the hospital navigator. We created a navigator with area agency because we found that people that weren't 60 were falling between the cracks, because if they were 60, adult protection took care of them. If they're under 60, nobody took care of them. So we sat down with, you know, the area agency and with the hospital and some other players and said, this can't be. We need to connect. And that's why if we have any role in this, it's that we're the connector and we're the convener, but we aren't the answer to everything, because I'll have less hair than I have now.
Sure. Question.
I have some discombobulated thoughts. One word that was mentioned was parity, and I think that that is something that, I don't know how we change 340. But we need to be a voice related to parity. You know, I don't know what happens to a hospital if somebody has a stroke and they put them on a park bench. What happens in that situation? Because A, I don't think they would do it, and there's a reason they wouldn't do it. And if they do it, what's the recourse? So I think that this concept of parity is very important, and a very critical role that we have to play to push the button to advance the issue across our system. I agree with the concept of navigators, and we have them and so on and so forth, and they work great with the hospitals that you have relationships with, but some of those admissions that end up at a boutique hospital, stuff like that, they don't even call you back to let you know that they're letting you. Again, it's not the people that we know, the people that we have relationships with, where we have those issues. It's the places where we don't that cause that.
That's why we need a little bit more teeth.
Yeah.
People putting people on park benches. I'm
What-
not sure what that means.
What I would say about the whole role in relationship to inpatient and, you know, minority report, you know, I think we trust an emergency room physician to know if somebody is hospitalized for every part of the body but the brain. Why do we need somebody from a community to come, what, like, this is where I think it's like, either we believe in parity or we don't believe in parity. Like, which way is it? Why can't we trust that medical opinion on that part of the body when we trust it on every other part of the body? That's
Because they're not trained in it.
But there is the challenge. So why do we tolerate it? So this is where it's like, I am like, if we set up a de facto system, then they're off the hook, right? You know, it's this, to me, the same way when hospitals say, I can't take that person because they're too violent, I can't take the person. Like, I'm sorry, I worked in the general hospital for a lot of years. You know, you can't tell an orthopedic ward, that person smells bad and, you know, I don't want them here. You know, you can't tell somebody, I won't take them in ICU because of who they are. You know, it's like, well, they don't match the milieu. You know, I'm like, we have got to do something to say this is not tolerable. I'm not saying those units might not need more money, more help, more training, more but it's like we speak with forked tongue kind of thing. It's like we can't have it both ways. You know, we need to, if we believe it, what do we need to put behind it to make it happen, knowing that it's not going to happen overnight? Or if we don't believe it, why? Because that is the state of our country, you know, and I just think that, so if I were to answer Lori's question about inpatient, I would say, I don't need to make that decision about whether somebody needs to be in the hospital. And I would say, particularly with the state hospital, because in the early days, Terry, when 1988 was around, there were thousands of SIDS patients in the state hospital. Now we've got people on call around the clock, and there might be 2 beds available. You know, like it's all of these resources for, you know, when we trust that role on every other part of the body. So anyway.
But I have an emergency room where there are at least 2 physicians who, if they see one of our people who with severe and persistent mental illness, and they see them more than once in a week, they kick them out of the emergency room. I can't do anything about that. I have no authority over that hospital. I can't do anything except beg the sheriff in that county to please transport the person to a hospital in another county. Bring it to one of our, I have 3 counties, bring it to one of our other counties, or bring the person to a neighboring county where I know that they will be treated appropriately. It's cruel. You know, we had a young woman walking nude down the highway. And I couldn't do anything about that. I don't have any authority or control over that hospital. And, you know, so all we can do at that point is, like I said, beg law enforcement or someone to take them somewhere else, which means I have an emergency room sitting in one of my counties that basically we can't use. And that sheriff is always having to transport people. And thank God he's willing to do it for me, because he doesn't really have to do it. You know, we could have that issue as well. At least they're willing to do that out of compassion, but that's another issue. You had something.
Yeah, I think we'll have Tracy's and then we're gonna move on to a different section. Thank you.
Having been part of a hospital-based system for many years, and we have an inpatient psychiatric unit as well, ER physicians don't do everything. They have all kinds of specialists on contract. They have dental and orthopedic and neurological and cardiac. So they screen for lots of things, and then they call in a specialist when there's a problem, and behavioral health is that specialist. And I can promise you, no ER physician, no matter how trained or kind-hearted they are, has the time to really listen to what the patient needs and ensure that they are served in the least restrictive manner possible. And I really think the behavioral health system is the entity to do that. Also with the hospitals, that is a violation of their regulations, and you can report them to Joint Commission or whoever they're certified under, usually Joint Commission. And that's a very serious violation what that ER is doing. And then I just need to comment too with the inpatient. I will tell you that our inpatient unit, you know, we work very closely, we're very aligned, and nobody wants to put a person on the park bench, and we don't do that, of course. But sometimes they are sent to a homeless shelter because there is no other housing available. It's always the last resort. But Metro you have to apply for and get on a waiting list. I don't have any places people can live for free until they get Metro. The group homes in our counties are full. We have residents from our counties and group homes out of county because there aren't enough group home beds. So it really is a last resort. But, you know, we can put whatever muscle we want on the hospitals, but we can't make them procure a resource that doesn't exist either. And community behavioral health agencies also refer people to homeless shelters because we can't find an option as well.
Thank you. Again, I think we'll move a couple. So next point, we're gonna actually move into the residential facility discussion. The first section is 340.037. I know this had been on our agenda for last meeting and we didn't get to it. So this is a section that specifies when an ADAM board may operate a facility or provide a behavioral health service. In general, you'll see when the board may operate is when the OMAS director gives the board prior approval and there is no other qualified public or private facility, community addiction service provider, or community addiction mental health services provider that is immediately available and willing to operate this facility or service. However, the director is subject to certain restrictions in giving approval. And this, these are the 4 restrictions on the director. So I wanted to ask if there should be any guardrails in place if an ADAM board becomes involved with the daily operations of this facility, and what should those be?
Question, why are the restrictions? Why was this in the law?
So, Dustin, do you have a comment about this?
No, and I'd add on another question. What other area is the government, in this case, a local board, entitled to go in and take over the practice of, primary care physician? Is the local health department enabled to do that and do they review the financials of that health group, of the hospital, is there an analogous area that we could look to that says how is this power executed? And is it necessary? Because we've got other legal means to address the winding up of an entity that is no longer an ongoing concern. We've got in the files and the transition of those patients to another provider seems like a wonderful use and what the board should be doing. I just don't know whether the board should be operating an entity is the weird thing I see.
Sherry?
I don't think in 20 years we have. I mean,
I have.
you had one, but it was because it was only in an emergency until somebody else came in.
Yeah, exactly.
This is not for any long-term, it's just in an emergency when something happens and they go in and they immediately get somebody else to come in. The only other place where I knew it happened, it wasn't exactly this scenario, but if there would happen to be a county, and some of our very, very rural counties may have no provider whatsoever that's willing to come in, that's what that allows for as well. But that's not as true anymore. There are so many providers that just doesn't happen. But this is only in a grave emergency. This is not a regular course of business. Pressure, maybe you can explain how it happened to you.
Sure.
That's what I was gonna say. You're exactly right. In emergency situations only happened to me once in 33 years. And, where we were without a director of an agency, rudderless. They were in horrible financial trouble, weren't able to make payroll. Director left, 3,000 people dependent. We went in until they could get somebody hired. And when you ask if there is an example of like a private entity and public coming in, we recently had a nursing home where, there wasn't any staff. And so they sent in the National Guard. They sent in a public entity during that emergency time to make sure that it happened. And I don't think there would be anything other than an emergency to do that, but you can't let 3,000 people overnight not have, when they see the doctor the next day, you can't do that. You have to ask.
So should there be timelines and milestones?
There is. I
Is
think
there?
it says,
Okay.
yeah, that you can only do it for.
No more than 1 year. I can tell you, and I'm breaking the third wall or whatever it is. I can tell you, we did do this in the past couple of years. It was in very similar circumstances to what Prussia talked about. And it was, all efforts were focused on continuity of care for the men, women, and families who were relying on that provider organization. And it was an all hands on deck situation. And it does require not just the department, the director has authority, but also the county commissioners to be involved. It was a very broad collaborative. And it was very short term.
So I noticed that a couple members commented on Division B of the section, saying that it doesn't seem to match the operating environment where behavioral health services are provided by private, non-community-based services. So I wanted to put it out there if you thought that the statute should be modified at all to specify that this division only applies to public community-based services, or, if you could elaborate on that comment. Division B is regarding the emergency situations.
Wouldn't that go back to a parity issue? if a person were being served with private insurance and at a private provider that suddenly closed, they still have the need as much as someone being served in a public entity. They would, I mean, I don't know about sending the board in to start running where, you know, a private practice, but still somehow making sure they have continuity of care regardless of what the entity was. Seems to me.
I'm also curious about the experience of rural areas with this statute. I don't know if you could speak to that, Robin, or any others, if you've had experience with this.
We haven't. There, we get all that. So no.
Sure. Okay.
So we did use this part of statute a number of years ago, not for us to take over an organization on a basis, but rather service. Had a provider that provided a prevention service that did high-risk after-school care and services for a number of children in our community. And they lost their ability to be able to appropriately supervise that service and could find someone else to come in. And so on an emergent basis, our board was granted the ability to be able to go in and supervise that service, and to do that for a short period of time. And we were able then, after several months, if we were able to find someone to take that person's place, but it worked well in that instance. Otherwise, that program would have closed down immediately because we were not allowed to either fund it, nor were they allowed to provide its service. So it can be used very broadly or in a very specific instance. In that instance, it worked very well. And I would say that at that time, the department moved very rapidly. We needed to have that done. And there was nobody else available to do it.
Dustin, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, in essence, the thought is, it sounds like they've always been contracted providers. Not, so we have a situation now where most services are provided by non-contracted providers. What would happen to the number of patients that they serve should they go belly up? Should they have that issue? How would 340 apply to them? Does it apply to them? Is it something that we need to be thinking about? Because something tells me the patients they serve have every bit the same right to continuity of care as those receiving it from a contracted provider. And secondly, I think the question was, is there any guide rails or guardrails we could put in? I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this one, but because we actually have used it, those who have used it, is there something that would have been nice to have? Is there something there that you didn't have when you needed to use it? That feedback would be helpful on answering that question.
I can tell you something that we did, but, you know, it's not stated in the law, but something that we did during that was give regular reports back, you know, to the department. You know, it was, I mean, I just assumed that it was a unwritten kind of thing, but if that would be helpful, I mean, had to be written reports so that you knew you were working towards trying to resolve the issue. Your question about private group going out, we had, you know, if you work long enough, you just about see everything, but we had a private group that started to do really poorly financially and started going around the community asking for money, so on and so forth. And so we knew they were in trouble. And we did reach out to them multiple times to say, you have a large caseload. You know, they were serving a lot of child welfare families, and we reached out to child welfare and said, do you know this provider is in trouble? You know, if you need to get people on services, we worked with our agency, and we have our contract agency make outreach to that private provider to kind of say, look, we're willing to take your patients to do things.
I don't know if I was within my rights, but that's what it was the right thing to do for people, so. So I don't know if it would be helpful to have anything more in statute about that or not. But I do think that when you know somebody is, a practice is changing, a retirement is happening or something like that, to make that outreach to make sure that those individuals have care is good practice.
Do we have anybody else online that would like to comment on this? Sherry, did you have your hand up?
No,
Oh, okay. So, we can probably go to the next slide then, related, also to residential facilities, the complaint section, complaint alleging abuse or neglect of an individual in a residential care facility. So this statute, requires a community behavioral provider that receives a complaint alleging abuse or neglect to report it to the ADAM board in which that facility is located. And then thereafter requires the board to report the complaint to OMAS for investigation. And then it also authorizes the board to enter the facility with or without the OMAS director. And if this health and safety of a resident is in immediate danger, to take necessary action. It also specifies that the board's action does not violate any resident rights. And it requires the board then to immediately report to the OMAS director the board's actions. So, looking at this statute, I wanted to see what you thought about what should be a board's role in investigating complaints of abuse and neglect and taking action to protect residents. Do you feel the statute needs to be modified in any way in regards to this?
This was added to the law about 23 years ago when there was a terrible case. Well, I mentioned it earlier, the 6 cases in Steubenville. We added this because nobody had the authority to evaluate. The people that did was newscasters went in, and 2 rapes. And there was 2 different days. They talked about 2 different rapes. And so the director and some of us got together and this was added.
And it was used not but a few years ago.
It was used a few years ago in another case up in Toledo. Right.
Yeah, that were being, not physically abused, but the situation was terrible. They were not being well taken care of and verbally and harassed and so forth. And it was used.
It's not going to be used a lot, but when it is, it's important.
It's necessary, yeah.
Sure, Teresa.
So just a couple of other kind of thoughts on this. I agree with it's necessary when there are significant concerns and challenges. I think the question is when these situations arise, sometimes you have lots of different people in the mix. And for the patient, the people living in the residential program, it feels very overwhelming because you may have multiple different entities involved who are telling you different things at different times. And when you are the provider of that residential service, you have so many different masters that you're not able to actually spend the time that you need to focus on mitigating the issue and providing the support to the people who are being directly involved, which are not just the residents, but also the staff. Because they're also, you may have 1 or 2 bad actors, but that does impact the rest of the operation of the organization. The other piece to recognize is this section references 5119.34, which does not include substance use disorder residential. So we have here an area where you have a divergence and you have a protection that exists for one part of the system, but not the other. And then, you add that, today, most of our residential programs for mental health are kids. We don't have very many adult residential programs. That's a problem. That's a continuum of care issue. That's an issue that we have to figure out from a capacity and I think to the conversation around inpatient hospital, part of the challenge is we don't have that next step down level of care, which is critically needed to support some people. So I think, and then you add the whole IMD issue, and we won't even go there, from a payment perspective. But I think those are some of the pieces in terms of just how do we do this in a way that also provides a trauma-informed experience and creates a centralized locus of accountability and concern. I agree in the immediate, absolutely, if that's the quickest way to get somebody involved to make sure that people are being safe and protected. But in that ongoing period, once this is initiated, how do we make sure that it's not 17 different masters and nobody really getting to the heart of helping the people living in that facility and the staff that have been impacted?
Sure, Samantha.
Yeah, I guess I'm just, and it's probably just my lack of understanding, but I'm trying to understand. So if I'm a person that's being served or I'm living and finding recovery in this space, and I conjure the bravery to tell my story and all that. Is it the board that has the authority to respond and take the next steps with me? Or like if I'm an adult, is it adult protective services? Is it children's services? So I'm not saying I disagree, I'm just trying to understand. So I saw also, Amy from Disability Rights Ohio spoke about being able to investigate these things as well. So I'm trying to understand how do we, I think, Molly, you mentioned it earlier. Clarity for me as a person. Who do I speak to who has the authority to take the next steps? Because if we're trying to say there's no wrong door, right, it's got to get somewhere. And so I'm just trying to understand, is it that we think that more people means that we'll get more of these reports and we'll be able to address them? Or do we need to focus on who is the entity that can actually take legal steps with me, and do we need to keep pointing people to that space? So I'm just trying to understand, as we add more doors, is that helpful to me if I'm being served, or is it confusing?
Sure, and that was actually the second question I was going to ask is what are the roles of these different bodies in investigations, between the boards, the child protective services, the adult protective services, and then other entities. So I don't know if anyone wants to speak on the appropriateness, what these roles should be.
So I think that is the issue. You've got, depending on the situation, you have multiple entities charged with a responsibility for abuse and neglect investigation. So you could have, disability rights, which has the ability to investigate. You can have child welfare, which has the ability to investigate. You could have the DD system, which has the ability to investigate. You have the mental health system that has the ability to investigate. You could have other entities, law enforcement is going to be in to investigate. So now you've got all of these different people coming in and asking the same information of the person who has just been through a traumatic experience. And that's part of the challenge. And then as the person managing that, having to have the resources to deal with all of those different entities who are asking the same or similar questions, and then all of the processes that go through that. So that's what I'm saying. Where is the locus of point of accountability? Because, and it may be that we can't get there because each system has its own responsibilities. But that is the very real experience that, that providers do have, particularly in residential care.
Teresa, in that example, though, it sounds to me like the person being served is a child who is DD with mental illness and substance use disorder.
That could be the scenario, yeah.
I will say from a person served perspective, it is really confusing who you should be going to and how you should be registering the complaint or the grievance. And certainly, I'm sure every single provider of any behavioral health service has a standard that says this is what you do to file a grievance, right? So that would certainly need to be gone over with each person who is being admitted or registered or enrolled in that service. so when that happens, I make the assumption that, there's a place that they always start. So they always start with the supervisor, right?
So under client's rights,
Mhm.
they can start with any entity. And we as providers have to post all of the various entities for which they can initiate a complaint.
Okay,
So it could be the provider, which is the preferred path, you start at the lowest level.
right.
It can be the board, it can be the professional licensing board, it could be Disability Ohio, it could be child welfare, it could be anyone, all the way up to and including the federal government.
Okay,
And as providers, we post that as,
which is why that's so confusing.
correct.
Yeah, yeah. So, so it is to me what you're saying, and I think everyone is, where, the buck stops where. And that's what we have to tell the people, is who is the ultimate in responsibility. And also, I know from what I have been told, there are challenges around, and I think I might have mentioned this earlier, challenges around these grievance processes in sort of the systems that are very familiar with one another and very, maybe more small and more rural, perhaps, I don't know, but the relationships that get built that are so critically important can also have sort of that other side of the coin where if I file a grievance, they're not going to do anything because they know each other and they're friends and they play poker on the weekends. And so there, somehow there needs to be a guardrail in there that helps to keep that from happening, helps to keep the politics from entering into it, helps to keep the good old boy system from being the system that is arbitrating grievances.
Wouldn't that be where the requires the board to report the complaint to Ohio Moss for investigation?
If the complaint is actually taken seriously and gets filed.
Can I ask just a clarifying question? Is there, so this is specific to abuse and neglect of a person in a residential care facility. So I don't know if it's in code or board specific, but there is a separate piece that acknowledges the general complaints and grievances, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we were.
And for someone who had involvement with this, any door's okay, I think was intentional. Because if a board didn't do their job, or legal rights didn't do their job, somebody will do the job to get in there. So I wouldn't any restrictions. The coordination, yeah, you could put language that it needs to be coordinated, but let's not lessen the ability of somebody to go in there to fix it.
So I think that this is a very specific section of the code written for a very specific circumstance with someone living in a residential care facility and receiving outpatient services from another community provider. If that provider has a complaint, then this is what can happen for a more immediate action. Maybe we can organize all of the sections related to claims and grievances and have another discussion another time where there's a more complete picture of what that pathway looks like for people accessing services. Is that helpful? I think we had good discussion today. I think we can move on maybe if we're okay with that and have a more complete discussion beyond this section of the code sometime.
Sure, I think that's a good idea. So that means that we can move on to our last roundtable discussion that we're going to start today. And then I don't think that we'll get through it all, so we would continue at the next meeting. And that's out of board organization size. So the next slide. So 340.02 is the main section in this group. And under current law, boards must have 18 or 14 members. And for the 18-member board, the OMAS director appoints 8, while board of county commissioners, the rate is 10. And then for a 14 board, then the OMOS director appoints 6, while the board of county commissioners appoints 8. And then the right-hand column on this slide shows the characteristics that appointees must have. And so just some of the things I wanted you all to consider and comment on is board size. Is there a number that's too large, too small? You want to start with that, Sherry?
Well, just in being transparency, this is one of the things that's going to be in Representative Swearingen's bill. And his bill is going to have 9, 12, 14, 15, 18. And we have supported it.
Representing families and those living with the illness, we don't even know, most of our people don't know what an ADMH board is, and certainly don't care how many board members there are. What we do care about, however, is that the family and those living with the illness voice be heard. And the governor, in his veto, I have it here, of Swedner's bill last fall, ever he vetoed it, maybe it was last winter. Budget. Now, when he vetoed it, his whole comment, the governor's comment, is he wasn't against the bill. He was against the taking out of those living with mental illness, those living with addiction, and their family members being removed. In the new bill that we're going to testify tomorrow on, he adds those back in. So.
Actually, he increased them. It will be 50% of all board appointees, regardless of side, member appointees.
By the way,
need to be individuals in recovery or a family member.
By the way, I asked for 100%. Didn't get it, so.
Well, and I want to say that with all due respect, individuals in recovery is very different than a family member. So I mean,
It's both.
Well, but if you, is it this many?
No, there
Or this
are people living with the illness and also appointment of a family member. So it's both. There are people.
Separated?
In
Separated
separate category.
by, okay, good. Thank you.
Not by number.
But not by number. So you could have 5 family members and, or 49% family members and 1% people with lived experience.
Well, under the law, that'll be Lori's decision because she appoints a number of those people. I think in the law it says she will appoint those members.
Well,
actually, the new law, it says that commissioners and the department are both responsible for seeing that 50% are individual.
Okay.
But to Molly's point, there's no minimum requirement that X number of persons with the lived experience satisfy the composition of the board.
They took it out that anyone. That's why it was vetoed, because nobody was going to be appointed that
So with this-
fit those categories.
The current version though, if all of the appointees are family members and no one with lived experience, does that meet as it's currently drafted?
It could technically, but it could also be the other way. It could be all individuals in recovery and no family members. I mean, I think for the most part, boards try to work with their county commissioners. They try to work with the department to,
I don't read it that way. I read it that it's very specific in his bill. I'm talking about his bill currently, is that it's a person with a lived experience and a family member and a professional, to be honest with you. So it's very specific. If a board has a family member and not someone with lived experience, then a lived experience person would be the one needed to be appointed to meet the requirement of the law.
So we're talking about proposed statute that we don't have in front of us, and I think that's going to be challenging, but I think talking about what we want it to be would be a good strategy here. So what I'm hearing is people with lived experience should be a required element of board membership. Family members should also be a required element of board membership, but not one or the other.
Can I be more specific?
Yeah.
People with lived experience of substance use disorder and people with lived experience of mental health and people who have family member with those issues should all be
included
I
categories.
understand what that last meeting, what was the reason for not saying, and a family member with mental, loving with mental illness and one with addiction. I just don't.
No, I just thought everyone was getting bored with me talking.
I think it was the same thing.
Yes.
Which is the current language. Categories is what I heard, are priority.
Yes, thank you.
Terry, you mentioned clinician. Is that something that?
Isn't that on there?
It's not in representative sworn.
It's in the current.
It's
statute.
current.
So is that something that's important?
That was incredibly difficult to do. When you try, especially again, in smaller communities, when you're trying to find someone who's a clinician who won't be working for an agency that you might contract with. At some point, it's very, very difficult to find somebody.
Is it not an option though for those people to recuse themselves in situations that are?
The law, we don't have we were a larger county, we're becoming a smaller county every census, but we don't have an issue with it, but I support, I mean, I desperately, or I strongly support family members and consumers. But I understand smaller counties, they can't get professionals. There are counties that every professional works at a contract agency, so they just don't fill the position. So why are we putting in a position where they can't do it? It just doesn't work, because if you're in a small county with one or two providers, they're gonna, and the law specifically says a board member cannot serve on a contract agency. We've had board members, they always apply, and we have to tell them, you have to resign from the board, your agency, we can't contract with you. So a lot of times people won't even apply because their agency would not be able to get funded. So I think the professional, if we could get it, it should be optional, but we can't keep it in there.
I currently have the position filled with a licensed social worker who works at a dialysis center. She never works with substance use or mental illness, but she's a licensed social worker, so she fits it for me. If I were to, look more generally in the community, sometimes it might be an agency that I don't currently contract with, but it would eliminate my ability to work with them in the future. So we don't want to do that either.
So I pulled up the bill.
Sure.
The way that it's written is it is a person with mental illness, a parent or other relative who has received or is receiving, has a mental health services, a person who's received addiction services, a parent or other relative of a person who has received or is receiving addiction services, and a clinician with experience in the delivery of mental health, or a clinician with the experience or delivery of addiction services. You're talking presently. That's the correct.
Yeah, and that's what the slide there.
That's what's in.
Yeah,
That
that's
is the,
law.
this, I'm reading from House Bill 523.
Oh, 523. Okay.
That, which version? The only one that exists today, which is the as introduced version.
So if we could not talk about proposed legislation, stick to what's in 340, and again, not even what's in 340, but what we'd like to see, what would help ideally with a board's ability to carry out their responsibilities. That's what would be most helpful. I think there will be plenty of discussion tomorrow, it sounds like, about this bill. And we can certainly rely on that testimony and that feedback to include it in these discussions. But looking at the organization of an animal board, and I know that you had some questions. We can just keep moving through that.
Sure, yeah. I wanted to find out what you thought about the ratio of the OMS director versus the county commissioner appointments. Whether you felt had any opinion on that.
Honestly,
Sure, Dwayne.
it really doesn't matter. And again, back to the professional, it would be wonderful, but I just know how challenging it is for the small county. So I just hate to put something in there that they can't fill. And several of the directors have said they're struggling where they'll put a social worker in that's really not in the field that meets the guidelines. So it'd be nice if it was preferred, but not required. It is, I like the split, some split between the director and the commissioners, because it keeps it it keeps it not political. Because if it was all county commissioners, it could become political. Or if it was all state, then, so I just think the split makes it it makes it fair.
I wonder if we couldn't, because of the issue with the clinical piece, if we could consider replacing that with maybe, at least one member that is, part of the peer system, so to speak. Not peers in work. I'm talking about like whether that's EMS or fire or child welfare or something like that, like, like a peer organization that interacts with our system, that could be represented on our board.
Like a part-time entity.
Yes, yeah.
Then we couldn't give them any funding.
Right, but, I don't give my police department funding, I don't give my I don't give my fire department
But we do,
funding.
we do.
But across, you give every single one of them, that's what I'm saying, if we had
A lot of them, you do, maybe not all of them know, but a great deal, and that's one of our challenges, is with the K through 12 dollars we came through, we continued some of that funding, and so I can't bring anybody in any one of my school districts to sit on my board, sheriff, either one of my JFSs. I mean, I have real limitations with that. So as much as I think that could be a good idea, perhaps the better language would be to look at some options, to see about the option of bringing in, if you are able to appear from another system, or if somebody else defined the system of care, since they're part of the system of care. But I think giving us some options, and to your point, in a smaller community, yeah, it's very difficult to find a clinician that we don't fund. Because again, we knock out that agency, so. Again, having the option of either or might be helpful.
This is a little bit different, but we've talked about persons with lived experience. I can't speak to anything about the boards filling a clinician at that spot. But if we're talking about persons with lived experience and we're talking about peers, why not add value to the peer certification and have, if we're, considering things, maybe consider a person who is a certified peer recovery supporter.
We probably fund them.
Yeah, we're hoping they're working.
You don't, well,
The board.
you probably fund the organization, so yeah,
So.
sorry. Just thinking.
I know.
I like the way you think, Mike.
Yeah, I'm gonna have you move to the next slide, because the other consideration is about ethical boundaries on who can be a board member. And so taking a look at these prohibitions on who can be, a board member or board employee, are there, should board members be able to be employed by the board or a contracted provider? Should they be able to serve on the board of a contracted provider? And these questions about relatives, can I hear your opinions on those issues?
It just opens up.
Tom?
It just opens up opportunities for conflict of interest. I think that we need to maintain boundaries, separation.
So you think the current statute works well with this? Is that what most you think? Anybody that thinks differently on this?
Well, it sounds to me like it's a challenge to find all the right categories because of this. And I get the conflict of interest, but I also know that there are ways to mitigate that in process. And so that would be something just to think about. I know you can, if you've got a small board and it's only, 9 people, then it would be a lot harder to get around the conflict of interest. But if you have a larger board and you can create some committees and some, firewalls between some of the decision-making processes, then you can mitigate those conflicts of interest, and you can have recusals that are actually meaningful and not just
for checking that box. I mean, conflict of interest is more, and I'm not a lawyer either, but I play one on TV sometimes too, Teresa. Conflict of interest is something that it needs to be transparent and acknowledged. It can always be avoided.
Sure, Dwayne.
I just want to say, I strongly disagree. I think, I understand what you're saying. In some cases it may work, but when you're on a board and some of your board members may be board members of contract providers, it puts the other providers at a disadvantage. It puts the director at a disadvantage. And I serve on a public board, and we have the same with the son. They can abstain from discussion. They can abstain. But it's very difficult for the other board members sitting around that table. It's very difficult. And it's just, this is, of all the part of the statutes that we're looking at, this is the cleanest thing that protects the rest of it, right? It is so good to say, I'm sorry, if you're on that board, you can't serve there. And it's not as much to protect me as a director, us as a director, it's to protect other providers, because they're sitting on the table, they're aware of the dollars coming in. And they also, we all have contracts. So you're gonna not fund somebody or fund somebody else, and they vote on your contract. Of anything here, this is the one that's the best thing. Am I right?
And some of this, frankly, board directors at local Adam boards are publicly appointed officials. So some of this, we would have to look at what the ethics law says, because some of it would be directly opposed to the ethics law. I mean, those board directors have to follow the same ethics law as public officials. And so some of it just wouldn't allow for it, frankly.
Hey, this is Helen Jones Kelly, and I can't find my hand to raise on this, so I'm just jumping in if you don't mind. And I am one of those people that is opposed to this. And it is because of the way in which we operate with connections and relationships in the community. And there are large institutions that have a very different view about how they manage mitigating this kind of a situation, so that there are ways in which board directors can serve on those broader community initiatives as a member of the board and to be protected. I file a financial disclosure and a conflict of interest every year anyway, but I think there are ways to come around this in order to be at tables where our input is really critical for helping to build our image as part of the business community. And I'm a lawyer, but at the same time, I'm a really invested community member who sees this as a true opportunity for us to raise the level of our recognition as a full community player. And not every board operates like our boards do in terms of who signs on contracts. So some of this is a non-issue in those cases where those businesses have ways that are set up that never bring a CEO or anyone into the contract process. So I think we may be limiting ourselves.
Sure, Tracy.
As a provider, I believe this rule should stay as is. To be very frank, I wouldn't want anyone from my agency serving on the board or anyone from another agency as well. That's firsthand privilege and knowledge of the board's priorities and plans and goals and budget and things like that. And frankly, it's low hanging fruit for a provider to sue a board if they lose a contract and it goes to the provider organization of the board member. It's very low hanging fruit. So I don't think any of us should be in that position.
So I'll say the opposite of that might be to have a rotation of all providers that rotate through sitting on the board. I just, I'm that person that wants us to think sideways sometimes.
And I'll jump in and say that I support what you just said. We can't just think of this within the context of our own provider system. There are hospitals and other entities out there where our voices are very important.
So I think Helen has,
It was on. Oh, there.
Helen, are you referring to the ability of us as board and members of our board serving on other boards versus people on our board? You're talking about the reverse, that first part where we
Right.
can't, I think, correct?
Right. Where we're precluded from being fully engaged with the community at that broader level.
I will have to, I haven't been approached about serving on a board like that, so I never even think of that, the statute in that relationship, because I'm always thinking about it from the other direction. So I don't know if there's a way to separate those out. I will say, like, we are a very, very, very small part of our hospital, so our hospital does withdrawal management services for us. We're probably, if you look at the millions of dollars they have and our contract being this big, but I mean, we had to ask a wonderful physician to leave our board. We had to ask, a wonderful, leader of their home health services to leave our board when we entered into that kind of contract. So while I appreciate how clean it is, and it's not certainly a hill I would die on, I do think that, I don't know if there's any way that we could, if there's enough distance and no association to contracting or something, if there's a way, but let's just say the bigger the tent gets, the more challenging it is.
And I can give you an example. When I became director, people wanted me on their board, and when I said, that's great, but I can't give you a contract, they all said, never mind. So I don't know if it was because I was a nice guy, they really wanted my money. So I'm not on any board.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask whether there should be any required trainings for board members. And if so, what kind of content would you recommend for that? Yeah, Sherry.
Well, we certainly, as the association, and as we do culture of quality, would have some, we think all board members should be trained in roles, rights, and responsibilities. They should be trained in ethics. They should be trained in the basics of mental illness and addiction. I mean, we think those are just some basic trainings they need to have. And then and I think they all do. Every board has an orientation and an orientation manual. We think those are important for the board's members to see too. I mean, we need to treat them like any public board. They need to be trained in kind of what they're doing. So we would believe in that.
And I would add to that list the training on involuntary commitments, because there were a lot of nuances to those rules, and misunderstandings can cause issues when there's complaints around it. So that would be helpful.
I think they should be trained on
Stigma reducing language and also financials and reading them and understanding them.
Any comments by any more of our virtual participants on any of these topics?
I would add implicit bias to general training. Yep.
So, Gallica, I'll have you go down. So, in terms of the terms of the board members, how do you feel about those that are in current statute? Do you feel that they're about the right length of term, or there any, I know there's also the restriction that no member may serve more than 2 consecutive 4-year terms under the same appointing authority. Any thoughts on terms at all? Pressure.
I do think that this idea that you have 2 terms under one authority and then flip to the next and then flip back and then flip back and then flip back. Like, you could have a board member that could be indefinitely on a board, and I don't think that that is the intent. I think the intent is that you know, you have people that have an opportunity to be on a board for a period of time. 2 terms is 8 years, you know, and then I think there used to be something in here where they had to be off the board for a year before they could be reconsidered. But I think the flip-flopping and allowing like this ongoing thing over and over, I think the year in between is a good thing.
Anybody else or thought about it? Teresa, do you have a comment?
Well, I don't know if, I mean, the 2-year terms and 3-year terms and 4-year terms, I mean, I think you need continuity of care. I don't, you know, or continuity across the board. I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other, but does that multiple layered term make sense? Or could it be simplified so that you have so many positions that you rotate a third or?
That's just a new board.
Yeah, that's just a new,
That's just a new
Yeah.
board, sorry. But you still have that, well, that's the new board.
Yeah.
Even that for a new board seems complicated.
All right, I think we can go down to the next one. There was generally consensus that 340.021 should be repealed, since it describes separate mental health and addiction services boards, which we no longer have. So we can go to the next one then. 340.022, of course, was just enacted during the most recent main appropriations bill. It has very limited applicability. Just wanted to see what your thoughts were on whether you believe there should be consistent requirements for all boards. That might, you know, where there's a situation where a board wants to withdraw from a joint county district, or what do you think of this, where it's based on county population? Are there any thoughts on this?
I'm not sure what you're talking about based on population. If originally when boards were selected, I think they had to have 40,000 or more people in a county. I think this is referring to like what happened in Erie, Ottawa, where one county withdraws, they have to have the ability then to join up with another county.
Yeah, it does. It's to a very specific situation.
Yeah, yeah.
And I guess the question is, should we be even having statutes like that in the Rise Code, you know, for very specific situations? Or is there a feeling that we should have consistency for all boards?
So I don't know that many of us, I know certainly I'm not a fan of doing statute to address one specific situation. I think though that the issue that was raised does lead to a conversation around if there wanted to be a change, how would that change occur? What if it's not, you know, in this case, it was a splitting, what if it wanted to be a merging? So how do we deal with that in a consistent way is something we probably should contemplate, but not leaving it the way that it is, was intended to deal with one specific scenario.
And we would agree with that. And I know we're not talking about splitting, but I think there is agreement that you have to have a way for a board to diverse, and you have to have a way for a board to merge. I mean, and so we do know that, you know, some boards, other boards have talked about, are there different ways to merge? And so that just didn't exist at the time.
You know, I can say from my former life in the affordable housing world, there were always conversations about housing authorities combining or merging, and, you know, going forward and thinking of offering things more regionally rather than, you know, as things may be currently structured now. I think that's really something that needs to be contemplated, because that merger is something that I would think may be more likely to happen, and can really be difficult conversations where I've seen organizations have no success in making any ground without some written guidance in a statute.
All right, any other comments on board organization or size this time? Sure.
I just have, one additional comment, just kind of circling all the way back to the composition and I don't know the right way to capture it in the language, but just making sure that we're really intentional around diversity. So diversity and, with experience, diversity in profession, diversity in race, ethnicity, age, all of the things. And so I think we just should think about how to be more intentional in that word composition. But not too intentional at recognizing, right, it's very different across our counties, but that there's just to really kind of, we take a look at that intentionally.
Oh, question.
And the comment I would make, I know it's in statute now, having 14 or 18 board members. I just really think it's for public policy to have variation. You have it's like you have a set number of county commissioners, a set number of people that are on public board, in general on public boards. And so I think consistency is very important. And we don't want to set ourselves up for, well, that board's good because it has this many, or that board's bad because they have this many, so on and so forth, that a public entity has a consistent form of government. Whatever that number is.
Sure. So, I really appreciate all these comments. I think for our other sections that are in this grouping, we wait until our next meeting because we're getting close to our time to leave here. So, I did want to open it up to the public comment opportunity. I know we had a hand raised by Eric Stewart. I don't know if he is still on.
I am. I had hoped to comment on the board composition and size, and only to say that in our review of the proposed swearing-in legislation, there was no mechanism to step up. We're a 14-member board, as I know there are a number across the state, and the way the proposed legislation was written, you would have to step down to a smaller size board, and we would be strongly opposed to that. If we stepped up to a 15 or 18, that would be fine. But, we're pretty blessed in our community by having a wealth of individuals who, both consumers and family members, as well as professionals, who are very committed and have, paid considerable involvement in our board and contributed significantly. We would not want to jeopardize that by having to step down to a smaller size board. It just wouldn't make sense for us. I understand that, there are some other rural boards that have, more struggles with trying to reach that number and in the composition that perhaps was proposed. But we would at least want anything that was proposed in legislation to at least reflect maybe a grandfather clause to allow us to remain at the current size or make that step up.
Thank you for that. Do we have any other public comments? I think I'll go. So it doesn't look like we have any other comments from the public. We can move to the next. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll move down to the we get to the last. Okay, yeah. So I just wanted to remind everyone of our next couple of meetings. We have Thursday, June 30th, back here as this room. We will continue the discussion on the sections we didn't get to on the out-of-board organization and size. And then other topics we were considering are the 340.036, the contracting authority, the interpretation and construction of chapter 340, which is in 340.011. And then we already got to the some of the out-of-board residential facility sections, but there's a couple others that we still haven't touched on, and then a couple that pertain to opioids. And then we also have Thursday, August 18th. And again, those topics will be decided on later once we kind of, determine whether we need to delve deeper into one or two particular issues. And then the next slide. So I just wanted to remind everyone that we also are having a public comment opportunity specifically on chapter 340. That's going to be Wednesday, June 22nd. It's going to be on Teams. And we will be asking each of you to advertise that in your newsletters or your announcements to your constituencies. And we will provide some announcement language that you can include in those publications. And then, thank you for being here today. I think we've had some really good discussions. I don't know, Director, if you wanted to end.
Yeah, no, I'll echo that gratitude. Thanks for all of you joining us remotely, for all of you in the room. It's been a really good discussion today. I think we did, start into some uncharted waters, which is good. That's what we're hoping to do, and push on those boundaries a little bit. And just to remind all of you, we do have people who are taking notes on all of this, and our quality planning and research team is developing themes and helping us really create what future conversations and some visioning would look like too. So this is an important process. I appreciate you setting aside the time for it. I know we're competing with many other priorities. Daily schedules. Thank you for prioritizing. All right, be well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.